She was 20 and empty. No home, no father, no bank account, just a canvas valise and $14.37 she had kept folded inside a paper napkin after 3 years of breakfast shifts. And with that amount, she bought a $1 weather-bent Mercantile in Downieville, Sierra County, California, a mining town whose western supply stop had fallen off county maps by 1931. The front sill had rotted into black meal. The roof bowed where winter snow had held too long. The county had condemned it since 1978 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the false bottom of a jammed brass cash register, in a hidden compartment that had not been opened in over 93 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hazel Mae Whitcomb had been arranging her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she lined up bent spoons by size in a chipped jelly jar, separated buttons by color in muffin tins, and smoothed grocery receipts beneath her palm until the paper lay flat and obedient. She had no name for this carefulness. The grown people around her called it fussing, or making do, or keeping out from underfoot, depending on whether they were tired or hungry or both. But Hazel knew the difference between a drawer that was merely closed and a drawer that was at peace. She knew how the right object in the right place could settle a room. She was born in Oroville, where the late summer hills turned the color of dry bread and the Feather River carried a coldness that seemed older than the town itself. Her first home was a narrow rental behind a tire shop, with a roof that pinged in the rain and linoleum worn to gray moons in front of the stove. At night, trucks passed on the highway with a long, mournful wash of sound, and Hazel would count them until sleep loosened her hands. Her mother, Ruth, kept house with the kind of silence that has no rest in it. She was a woman with quick wrists and tired eyes, forever rinsing something, folding something, scraping something from the edge of a pan. Ruth could stretch a pound of beans across 4 meals and could mend a cuff so evenly the thread seemed woven there from the beginning. But the world had taken some early brightness from her, and whatever remained she guarded like a match in wind. Hazel's father was a photograph in a shoebox, a name spoken with practical care and never near bedtime. Samuel Whitcomb had repaired agricultural engines, pump motors, and diner refrigerators from Chico to Marysville, carrying his wrenches in a green metal box with brass corners. Hazel remembered almost nothing of him except the smell of clean oil and wool, though that memory might have belonged to his jacket more than to the man. He died when she was 4, on a rain-dark road outside Live Oak, when a produce truck jackknifed before dawn. After that, the house became more exact. Ruth paid bills on Fridays and cried only when water was running. Hazel learned not to ask for new shoes until the soles had a true hole. She learned that hunger was quieter if you folded laundry, and fear was less large if you swept a floor from corner to corner. The world, she discovered, could not always be made kind, but it could sometimes be made orderly, and order was a kind of lamp. On Saturdays, when Ruth worked the early shift at the laundry, Hazel was sent to her mother's aunt in Gridley, a widow named Mabel Armitage who lived in a 2-room house beside an irrigation ditch. Aunt Lorna was not soft in the usual grandmotherly way. Her hands were knuckled and brown, her back bent forward from years at counters and card tables, and she smelled of brass polish, cedar shavings, and black coffee boiled too long. She wore her gray hair in a braid pinned like a rope at the back of her head and kept a jeweler's loop on a ribbon around her neck. Lorna had once worked the estate sales of the whole Northern Valley, buying what other people dismissed, cleaning it, repairing it, pricing it honestly, and selling it from a booth no wider than a church pew. She knew porcelain by the sound it made under a fingernail. She knew which drawer pulls were stamped, which were cast, which had been replaced by somebody hurried and careless. She could date a kerosene lamp by the shape of its collar and tell whether a quilt had been loved, stored, or displayed by the fading along its folds. Her house was modest, but it contained more history than any museum Hazel had seen. There were cigar boxes full of watch gears, stacks of ledgers tied with cotton tape, milk glass vases turned upside down to keep dust from gathering in their throats, and a cabinet of hand tools so clean they looked devotional. Nothing in Lorna's house was expensive in the proud way. Everything had been kept. Their weekend ritual began after breakfast. Lorna would spread a flour sack towel across the kitchen table, set out 3 objects, and ask Hazel what she noticed. A brass hinge, a cracked saucer, a pocket knife with 1 broken scale. Hazel was never allowed to guess value first. Value came last. First came material, condition, usefulness, age, damage, maker's mark, repair, and story. People lie, Lorna would say, lowering the loop into Hazel's palm. But where tells the truth? Hazel held that sentence the way some children hold prayers. It meant a chair leg knew who had leaned back too far. A wooden counter knew where hands had worried the edge. A ledger knew whether a man intended to repay or only wanted to be trusted until Tuesday. Where was not ugliness? Where was evidence? It was the honest record left behind when voices had gone quiet. By the time Hazel was 12, Lorna had her reading account books from estate boxes, checking columns with a pencil and finding mistakes no adult had found. At 14, she could clean the dried grease from a Singer treadle gear without scratching the nickel plate. At 15, she could tell the difference between a true dovetail drawer and one made to pretend. Lorna taught her to oil a hinge with the tip of a needle, to wrap glass in newsprint diagonally, to never force a stuck lock, and to listen for the sound a machine made when it wanted patience instead of strength. Those Saturdays were the best rooms of Hazel's childhood. Outside, trucks groaned along the county road, crop dusters made slow turns over rice fields, and the irrigation water shone with a hard white light. Inside, the 2 of them sat close over another person's discarded life and gave it back a little dignity. Lorna did not praise much. When Hazel worked well, her aunt would slide the object nearer and let her finish. That was enough. Lorna died in November of 2018, after a short illness that began with a cough and ended in a hospital room where every sound seemed wrapped in plastic. Hazel was 16. Ruth signed the forms because she was next of kin, and Raymond Klein, Ruth's second husband by then, drove them home with the radio tuned to a sports station. No one asked Hazel whether she wanted to sit a while in Lorna's house before it was cleared. By the time she got there 2 days later, the green cabinet of tools was gone. The ledgers were gone. The cigar boxes, the loop, the rolls of cotton tape, the little drawers of brass screws sorted by head and length, the price tags Lorna had written in her slanted hand, all of it had been folded into the general current of disposal. Raymond said a man from Yuba City had bought the lot for cash. Ruth stood by the sink with her arms crossed, looking down into a bowl that did not need washing. Only one thing remained for Hazel. In the back of the closet, fallen behind a crate, she found a narrow awl with a pearwood handle split at the end. It was not valuable. It had a rust bloom near the ferrule and a point worn short from decades of use. Hazel wrapped it in a dish towel and carried it home inside her coat sleeve. Raymond Klein was not a shouting man, which made outsiders believe he was mild. He worked seasonally in equipment sales, wore square-toed boots polished too brightly, and chewed wintergreen gum with a slow, wet precision. He had a way of entering a room and making its air belong to him. He did not forbid Hazel to speak. He simply waited until she stopped. He moved through the house, correcting small things. A cup left near the sink. A sweater on the back of a chair. A light burning in the hallway. If Hazel read at the kitchen table, he placed his keys on the page. If she repaired the toaster, he said she was making a mess. If she brought home tips from the diner and counted them into envelopes, he smiled without warmth and told Ruth that the girl was secretive. Ruth changed around him. She did not become cruel. That would have been easier to name. Instead, she became absent while standing there. Her face turned slightly away whenever Hazel needed one clear sentence. She let Raymond make decisions and called it keeping peace. The house grew more polished and less habitable. The counters shone. The rooms felt cold. Hazel left school after graduation and took breakfast shifts at the Silver Griddle off Highway 99, where the coffee was strong enough to stand a spoon in and the regulars wore ball caps stained with field dust. She worked split days when she could get them, mopped after closing, and learned the register better than the manager. Coins faced one direction in her drawer. Receipts were bundled by hour. If a customer argued over a bill, Hazel could reconstruct the meal from memory. 2 eggs over medium, wheat toast, side of sausage, coffee refilled 3 times. She was saving for a room of her own. Not a dream house, not a new life with white curtains, only one locked door and a table where no one moved her papers. For 3 years she put aside 1s and 5s, sometimes a 20 when a farmer tipped kindly after harvest, sometimes nothing for a week when the car needed gas. She kept the money in envelopes at first, then in a flour tin, then finally in a credit union account opened with Lorna's awl in her coat pocket like a witness. The eviction came on March 14, 2021, at 6:30 in the evening. Rain had been falling all day. A narrow, determined rain that slicked the porch boards and darkened the hems of Hazel's jeans. She came home smelling of bacon grease and dish soap, with her diner shoes in a plastic bag because the soles had split near the toes. In the living room, beside the recliner Raymond had bought with Ruth's tax refund, her canvas valise stood packed and buckled. It was Lorna's valise, brown, square-sided, with one brass clasp that had to be lifted and pressed at the same time. Hazel knew the mark near the handle where Lorna had once set it too close to a stove. Beside it sat a paper grocery sack containing 3 shirts, 2 pairs of socks, her work apron, the awl wrapped in a washcloth, and nothing else. Raymond stood by the window, chewing gum. Ruth stood near the hall, one hand resting against the wall as if she had come there by accident and could not remember why. Raymond did not raise his voice. "You are not living under my roof any." 8 words.
Exact as a receipt.
Hazel looked at her mother then, not at Raymond. Ruth's mouth moved once, a small tightening at one corner, but no sound came out. Her eyes settled on the valise, then on the floor. In that silence, something Hazel had been balancing for years came down without noise. Not shattered, settled. She picked up the grocery sack, then the valise. The brass clasp clicked against its own plate, a tiny old sound from Lorna's hands. Raymond opened the door before she reached it, and rain moved across the threshold in a sheet. Ruth stayed where she was. Hazel walked to the bus stop under a blue vinyl jacket that did not shed water anymore. By the time the bus came, her hair had flattened to her cheeks and the paper sack had softened at the corners. She sat near the back with the valise on her knees, not because she was afraid someone would take it, but because holding it gave her hands a duty. For 6 weeks she moved through California, the way a dropped needle moves across a floor, nearly invisible until it catches light. In Marysville, She slept 2 nights behind a closed laundromat where dryer vents breathed warm lint into the alley until midnight. She bought a banana, a day-old roll, and a cup of coffee from a gas station, spending $3.18 because the clerk let her use hot water for free. In Sacramento, she slept upright in a bus depot until a security guard tapped the bench with 2 fingers and told her she had to keep moving. His voice was not unkind. His rule was older than both of them. She found dishwork for 4 days near Stockton, paid in cash from a cigar box after the lunch rush. She counted every bill twice, then used most of it to replace her diner shoes at a thrift store on East Fremont Street. The shoes were half a size too large, but the soles held. At night, she lay beneath an overpass where traffic made the concrete tremble against her shoulder blades, and she listened to the wheels above her, carrying other people toward rooms with lamps. In Modesto, a woman from a church pantry gave her tuna packets, crackers, and a wool cap with a pom-pom cut off. In Merced, she washed in the sink of a grocery store restroom and dried her face with brown paper towels that smelled faintly of iron. In Fresno, she nearly called her mother from a payphone outside a pawn shop, but when the dial tone filled her ear, she saw Ruth's lowered eyes as clearly as if they had been printed on the metal. Hazel hung up and kept the quarter. Then came Virgil Keene, though it is better to speak of him plainly and not give him too much room. He was 31, charming in the practiced way of men who entered diners near closing and asked tired waitresses when they get off. He said he knew a motel owner in Bakersfield who needed a front desk clerk. He said the work came with a room. He said Hazel had the kind of careful face people trusted. She wanted to believe in a door. For 11 days they traveled together in his faded Pontiac, south through dry towns and almond groves, with Hazel's valise in the back seat and her savings folded inside a bank envelope beneath the spare tire well because Virgil said motels had thieves. At a roadside lodge west of Barstow, he went out for cigarettes while she slept. By morning the Pontiac was gone, and so was the envelope, and so was the last photograph she had of her father, which had been tucked beside the money for safekeeping. The motel owner knocked at 9 and told her the room was paid only through checkout. Hazel did not cry in front of him. She stripped the bed, though no one had asked, folded the blanket across the chair, wiped the sink with a towel, and set the key on the dresser. Outside, the desert light was white and without mercy. She had the valise, the grocery sack, the awl, and the $14.37 she had kept separate in a paper napkin inside her apron pocket, not from wisdom, but from habit. Breakfast shift money. Emergency money. Money too small to matter to a thief in a hurry. She headed north because heat felt less dangerous in that direction. Rides came uncertainly. A retired couple took her as far as Bakersfield after she helped change a tire in the parking lot of a fruit stand. A produce driver let her sit beside crates of lettuce to Manteca, where the cab smelled of diesel and wet cardboard. From there, she spent 2 nights in a hay barn outside Lodi, with permission from a woman who owned 3 goats, and asked no questions after Hazel fixed the latch on a feed-room door. By early May, the money had become numbers she could feel in her fingers. $12.84. $9.10. $7 even after soup. $5.62 after a bus transfer and a bruised apple. She wrote each amount in pencil on the back of a diner receipt, not because the accounting helped in any practical way, but because exactness kept her from disappearing from herself. The public library in Auburn stood on a rise above the street, with brick steps warmed by afternoon sun and a bulletin board in the entryway covered in notices. Lost cat. Piano lessons. Firewood. Senior exercise. Rooms for rent that cost more per week than Hazel had left in the world. She went in for water first, then for the restroom, Then for a chair in the periodicals corner where no one looked at her too long. She stayed 3 hours. The library smelled of paper, carpet dust, and the faint sweetness of old glue. Rain tapped the high windows, though sunlight still lay across the reading tables. Hazel read newspapers she did not care about, mostly to rest her eyes on columns and dates. Her hands had begun to tremble from tiredness when she found the classified section of a weekly mountain paper folded inside a stack of local notices. At the bottom of the 3rd page, beneath an advertisement for firewood and above a notice for estate cleanouts, a boxed line had been circled in blue pen by someone who had not returned to claim the paper. Sierra Skankety Public Auction, abandoned commercial parcel, former Mercantile in structure. Downieville's minimum bid, buyer assumes all prekented. Hazel read it once, then read it again more slowly. The listing gave a date 3 days away and an office address. It used words that warned sensible people away: condemned, no utilities, structural deterioration, demolition pending, no warranty expressed or implied. It was not an opportunity in the cheerful sense. It was a burden the county wanted lifted from its books. But Hazel had spent her childhood learning that unwanted things were not always worthless. She had been taught to look under dust, to test the hinge before discarding the box, to read wear as record. A store, even a ruined one, had drawers. It had counters. It had shelves. It had a history of hands. More than that, it had a deed, and a deed meant a place on paper where a person could stand. She copied the address onto the back of her receipt, careful to include the room number. Then she folded the clipping into the paper napkin with the money, as if the two belonged together now by law or need. Outside, evening had lowered over Auburn, softening the brick fronts and gathering under parked cars. Hazel sat on the library steps until closing, watching people pass with umbrellas and grocery bags and keys already in their hands. The decision did not arrive like courage. It arrived like arithmetic. She counted what she had left. She checked the bus schedule posted near the station. She considered food, distance, and the way her shoes rubbed the backs of her heels. She considered the fact that no one was expecting her anywhere. Then she bought one ticket as far as the route would carry her into the foothills, keeping back enough for bread, a can of beans, and the $1 she might need to hold up in a county office if the world was strange enough to let her. At dawn she stood beside the bus bay with Lorna's valise against her shin and the awl wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the sack. The sky over the Sierra Nevada held a thin gray light, cold and honest. When the bus doors folded open, Hazel climbed the steps without looking back. By sundown the next day, she would be walking toward a town that had once weighed gold by the ounce, toward a condemned, wooden store nobody wanted, toward a locked brass register that had been waiting longer than anyone alive could remember. The foothill bus left her at the Grass Valley station under a sky the color of wet pewter, and from there the road narrowed as if the mountain itself were closing a careful hand. Hazel rode the last public route as far as a turnout near Camptonville, where the driver lowered the door and looked at her valise with a doubt he did not speak. The schedule tape behind his seat had stopped naming towns after that point. Beyond him lay State Route 49, climbing through timber, creek bends, and scars of earth where men had once torn at the hillsides for gold. He told her Downieville was still more than 20 miles if she stayed with the road. Then he handed her a folded paper cup of water from the cooler and said the nights up there could bite even in May. She thanked him. The door sighed shut. For the first hour, walking was only walking. The road shouldered into the trees and dropped away toward the river, which moved somewhere below with a cold, stony voice. Pine needles darkened the edges of the pavement. Madrone trunks showed through the mist, red and smooth as scraped cinnamon, and water ran in thin lines down the ditches left by snowmelt. Hazel carried the valise in her right hand until the handle pressed a welt into her palm, then switched it to the left, then held it against her hip with both arms as trucks passed and pulled the air from her coat. By afternoon her shoes had opened the skin above both heels. The narrow wool cap from the church pantry held rain away from her hair but not from her neck. She counted the mile markers because counting gave her a way to move inside time. 12 miles. Then 13. Then the long bend near a cattle gate where a handwritten sign leaned under blackberry canes, warning hunters against trespass. She did not trespass until dark made the road more dangerous than the sign. The barn stood beyond a collapsed rail fence, empty except for last year's hay and a swallow's nest pressed into the rafters. She stepped inside calling hello twice, not loudly, then waited. No answer came. The structure smelled of dust, straw, mouse droppings, and the deep dry sweetness of animals that had not stood there in months. She set the valise beneath a plank wall where wind could not reach directly, took off her shoes, and laid her socks across a broken rake handle. By midnight the temperature had fallen to 38 degrees. She knew because an old round thermometer, clouded but still faithful, hung from a nail near the feed-room door. Hazel wrapped herself in her jacket, tucked the awl bundle under her ribs as if it carried warmth, and slept in pieces among the hay. Each time she woke, rain touched the roof in patient taps. Each time, she listened for footsteps, heard only the river and wind, then closed her eyes again. At dawn she left no sign of herself except the flattened place in the hay and 3 loose strands of wool caught on a splinter. She walked the remaining miles slowly, resting at culverts, rinsing her face with creek water where the bank was safe, and eating bread folded around cold beans from the can. The road became steeper in ways a map would not confess. Its curves had memory. Around one bend, the North Yuba appeared below her, pale green and quick between dark boulders, and the sight of it steadied her more than food had done. Downieville came into view near mid-afternoon, not all at once, but in pieces between trees. Roof lines first, then a church steeple. Then weathered facades gathered close to the river, as if the town had been set down in a narrow palm and told to make itself sufficient. She passed a post office with a flag moving without hurry, a hardware storefront with galvanized buckets stacked outside, a grocery with 2 apple crates beside the door, a cafe whose windows were clouded by steam, and a mountain newspaper office with a faded signboard and 1 light burning over a desk. No one stopped her. That was a mercy. The town was not dead, but it had a listening quality. A dog lifted its head from the shade of a pickup and let it fall again. Somewhere a hammer struck twice, then paused. The river spoke under everything, giving the whole place a steady undertone, like a person reciting numbers softly to keep from forgetting. Hazel stood at the corner long enough to read the street signs, then followed a sloping sidewalk toward the county building. The Sierra County Courthouse was white, upright, and older than the ordinary business of the day. Its steps had been worn down in the middle by boots, dress shoes, work soles, and perhaps, long before Hazel, miners with dust in their cuffs and claims folded in their pockets. Inside, the entry smelled of floor wax, paper, damp wool, and steam heat lingering from the morning. A glass case held mining tools, sepia photographs, and a scale for weighing gold, all arranged beneath labels typed so evenly they seemed to have been made by someone who respected margins. Hazel wiped her shoes on the mat until no more mud came free. Then she climbed the interior stairs and found the office named in the notice. The county clerk's room was narrow, but every part of it had purpose. File cabinets stood in patient rows. A wall clock ticked above a calendar showing a snow-covered bridge. Rubber stamps rested in a wooden tray beside an ink pad darkened at the edges. Behind the counter sat a woman in her late 60s, compact and straight-backed, with silver hair cut under her chin and eyeglasses hanging on a beaded chain. Her cardigan was the blue of washed denim, and a pencil had been tucked behind her right ear, so long it had left a shallow mark in her hair. The nameplate on the counter read Miriam E. Shilkins, Canty Clerk. Miriam looked over the frames of her glasses, first at Hazel's face, then at the valise, then at the paper clipping Hazel unfolded with hands that tried to be still. "You came about the Mercantile parcel." "Yes, Mom." The clerk did not reach for the paper. She sat back, folded both hands on the counter, and studied Hazel the way one studies a bridge before crossing it. "You understand this is not a residence?" "Yes, Mom." "You understand there is no water service connected?" "Yes, Mom." "You understand the electrical panel was removed years?" "Yes, Mom." "You understand the roof has failed in 2 places, and the county has posted it unsafe?" "Yes, Mom." "You understand purchase does not erase the demolition order unless repairs are approved before the deadline?" "Yes, Mom." Miriam's mouth tightened, but not with cruelty. It was the expression of a person who had hoped one warning would do the work of 5. She drew the clipping toward herself and laid it flat beneath her palm. "There are no other bidders." Hazel nodded. "The county takes no responsibility for injury, loss, vermin, weather damage, contamination, theft, or disappointment." "Yes, Mom." At that, the clerk removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Disappointment is not a legal category," she said. "It should be." Hazel did not know whether to answer. Miriam put her glasses back on and opened a drawer. The paperwork came in layers. Parcel description, quitclaim deed, release of liability, acknowledgment of condemnation, statement of buyer's assumption, a temporary stay of demolition, provided the purchaser submitted visible stabilization within 90 days. Hazel read every line. The clerk seemed ready to explain, but Hazel moved through the pages with the slowness of someone who had spent years reading receipts, notices, rules, and the unkind language of offices. She did not understand all of it, yet she understood enough. The county wanted the building off its conscience. Hazel wanted one place no man could order her from before supper. Miriam pointed to each signature line. Hazel signed her whole name where instructed, pressing hard enough for the pen to mark the sheet beneath. When she set the dollar on the counter, it looked almost foolish there, a single worn bill with a corner softened by many pockets. The clerk took it without ceremony, wrote a receipt, and placed the bill under a brass paperweight shaped like a pine cone. Then came the stamp. Miriam lifted it from the tray with both hands. It was heavier than Hazel expected, a brass-handled county seal mounted on a black base, its metal worn bright where generations of fingers had pressed. The clerk aligned the page, checked the margin, and brought the stamp down with one deliberate motion. The sound filled the room. Not loud. Final. A dry mechanical kiss between paper and law. She stamped 3 more pages, each with the same exact care, then slid the deed into a manila envelope and wrote the parcel number across the front. "You will take Main Street west until the pavement begins to bend with the river," Miriam said. "Past the newspaper office, past the church, then keep left near the old walnut trees. There is a service lane that no one calls a road anymore. It meets the back of the parcel. The front faces what used to be Jersey Flat Road on the older maps, though you will not see that name posted now. Hazel folded the envelope beneath her arm. Thank you. Do not sleep inside tonight, Miriam said. Hazel looked up. The clerk had made her voice official again, but her eyes had lost that office distance. She glanced toward the valise, then toward the rain-streaked window. If you must shelter there, stay away from the front wall. The sill is given way. Use the back room if the floor holds. Test every board before trusting it. Do not light a fire in the stove until the chimney has been cleaned. Do not drink from the well until it has been tested. If you hear shifting in the roof, leave, even if it is raining. Yes. Mom. Miriam held the envelope a moment longer instead of releasing it. Her gaze had gone to Hazel's signature, or perhaps to the last name written there. Whitcomb, she said quietly. Hazel's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Yes. Mom. There was a woman came through here years ago. Not with that name. Older. Valley woman. Bought estate boxes after tax sales. Knew a brass register from a plated one without touching it. Miriam looked at Hazel more closely now. She had eyes that did not hurry. Hazel said nothing. The room seemed to narrow around the ticking clock. Kin of yours. My mother. Miriam breathed out through her nose. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Perhaps. Arriving late, but sure. She came up after the old Pike estate sale in the 90s, the clerk said. Bought a crate of store ledgers nobody wanted. I remember because she corrected the auctioneer on a walnut cash drawer. Said the wear was wrong for the period. He did not like that. A faint warmth moved through Hazel, though her clothes were still damp and her feet hurt inside the wrong-sized shoes. She would do that. She paid her fees in exact change, Miriam said. Wrapped in paper. Every coin facing the same way. Hazel lowered her eyes. The brass stamp sat between them, its handle dull from honest work. The clerk released the envelope at last. Then maybe you know enough not to force what is stuck. Hazel placed the deed inside her valise, between two folded shirts, where the paper would stay flat. I was taught that. Miriam nodded once, then reached beneath the counter and brought out a photocopied map. It had been marked in red pencil, with an X near the river and a dotted line to the service lane. Take this. Bring it back if you can. Keep it if you cannot. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. Hazel stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the town as a property owner, though the phrase did not fit her body yet. She owned no bed, no pan worth naming, no lamp, no clean pair of dry socks, but an office upstairs had recorded that a condemned wooden building now answered to her name. That was not comfort. It was weight. Still, it was weight she could carry. She followed Main Street past the same businesses, seeing them differently now because they were not merely places she passed. They were neighbors, whether they knew it or not. At the cafe, a woman in a white apron set a tray of rolls near the window to cool. At the hardware store, an older man with a gray mustache lifted a sack of lime onto a dolly and moved as if his back had made a lifelong argument with labor and lost by inches. The grocery door opened, and the smell of oranges came out into the damp air. From the newspaper office, a typewriter clacked in short bursts. The post office flag snapped once, then fell still. A black and tan dog followed her for half a block at a distance of 10 feet. It had one torn ear and the solemn manners of an animal that had appointed itself inspector of arrivals. When Hazel turned toward the lane, the dog stopped, sat, and watched her go as though it knew better than to cross that boundary. The walnut trees appeared just where Miriam had marked them, 3 of them in a row along the low ground, still bare from winter but furred at the tips with new leaf. Their trunks were thick, twisted, and plated in gray bark. Beneath them lay husks from years past, blackened and pressed into the mud. A neighbor's fence leaned behind the trees, and beyond it a woman in a yellow raincoat was taking laundry from a line before the damp could reclaim it. She saw Hazel, paused, then lifted one hand in a reserved greeting. Hazel lifted hers back. The service lane was not truly a lane anymore. It was two sunken tracks with grass between them, soft from rain and crossed by roots. Blackberry canes had worked their way in from both sides. A rusted barrel lay on its side near a broken gatepost. The river could be heard more clearly here, not seen, but present with the force of moving glass. Hazel walked slowly, not because she was admiring the place, but because mud pulled at her shoes and the valise knocked against her knee. Then she saw the Mercantile. It stood at the edge of a shallow rise above the river road, square-fronted and stubborn, built of weathered pine boards gone silver and brown by turns. The building was roughly 30 feet wide and 50 feet deep, with a false front facade that rose above the roofline like an old theater backdrop. The front porch sagged toward the left corner. Two windows faced the road, one boarded, one webbed with cracked glass. The roof was corrugated metal over older shakes, patched in places with tar that had failed and peeled back in black curls. A brick chimney leaned from the rear slope, missing mortar along its crown. The sign still hung above the porch, though one chain had shortened with rust and pulled it crooked. Most of the paint had been scoured away by weather, but if Hazel stood at the right angle, she could read the ghost of letters beneath the gray. Pike & Sons Mercantile. The words were not welcoming. They were simply there. A padlock hung on the front door, but the county had left a key in a sealed envelope inside the packet. Hazel broke the paper with her thumb. The key was new and silver, without memory. She crossed the porch carefully, testing each board before giving it her weight. One plank near the left post sank with a soft, rotten sigh. Miriam had been right about the sill. The whole front of the store had settled forward by a fraction, enough that the door scraped the threshold before opening. The first smell was damp wood. The second was dust. The third, arriving after the door had been open a few breaths, was something metallic and faintly sweet, like pennies held too long in a closed fist. Hazel stood on the threshold until her eyes adjusted. Light entered through broken seams in the boards and fell in narrow bars across the front room. Dust moved inside those bars, slow and visible, disturbed by the door for the first time in months, perhaps years. She did not step blindly. She set the valise down outside, took the awl bundle from the sack, and used the handle to tap the floor just beyond the threshold. The first board answered firm. The second gave a dry flex. She shifted right. Another tap. Better. She entered with one hand on the doorframe and one foot placed where the floor joists would likely run, remembering Lorna's lessons about weight and span. The Mercantile's front room had once been orderly. Even neglect could not hide that. Shelving lined the side walls from floor to shoulder height. The upper boards bowed but still holding rows of empty tins, broken boxes, mouse-chewed paper, and a few green glass bottles filmed with dust. A long counter ran along the left side, its top worn pale where elbows had leaned and coins had slid. Behind it stood cubbyholes labeled in a hand too faded to read. Near the center of the room, half covered by a fallen strip of tar paper, sat the brass cash register. Hazel saw it and stopped. It was not handsome in the polished way. It was dark, greened at the seams, and heavy-looking, with ornate scrollwork nearly swallowed by grime. Its keys were round, ivory-colored, and most had cracked under age or heat. The drawer was closed. A spider had made a web between the crank and the side plate. A strip of county caution tape lay across its base, brittle as onion skin. She did not touch it. Not yet. Sound changed inside the building. The river became a low continual hush beneath the floorboards. Rain ticked through some opening above the rear wall and dropped into a metal pan someone had placed there long ago. Plink. Wait. Plink. From somewhere in the ceiling came the faint, quick scratch of a living thing smaller than a hand. The air held cold in pockets. Hazel could taste dust when she breathed through her mouth. The back room was reached through a doorway whose curtain rod still hung empty above it. There the ceiling was lower, and the smell changed to burlap, old ashes, and damp plaster. A cast-iron stove stood against the inner wall, rust along its seams and a small heap of fallen mortar in its firebox. Beside it was a work table with one leg repaired by a board nailed diagonally. Hooks lined the wall above, most empty, one still holding a coil of wire hardened with age. In the far corner, a narrow stair led down to a cellar door that had been nailed shut with two boards crossed over it. Hazel walked the perimeter with the method of someone inventorying loss. One broken chair, one broom handle without bristles, 3 mouse nests in the lower shelves, a stack of ledger covers with the pages torn out, a porcelain doorknob in a cigar tin, tin ceiling panels spotted with rust, water stain over rear joist, window sash swollen, stovepipe disconnected, back door jammed but not beyond repair. She found the safest place near the work table, where the floorboards felt firm under both heels. There she laid out what she owned. Valise, sack, coat, all, deed packet, bread heel wrapped in paper. The can, empty now, washed in creek water. She removed her shoes and socks and examined the torn skin at her heels without drama. Blood had dried into the threads. She set the socks near the stove, though there would be no fire. The building cooled as evening came. Through a gap in the rear boards she could see the walnut trees darkening against the mist and the first light in a neighboring window beyond the fence. She thought of the clerk's warning about the chimney. She thought of the dog at the lane. She thought of the brass register in the front room, sitting in its film of years, and of Aunt Lorna's voice reminding her that force was often ignorance wearing boots. Hazel ate the last of the bread slowly. She drank from the paper cup the bus driver had given her, refilled from a public fountain before she left town. Then she spread her jacket on the floor beneath the work table and folded one shirt for a pillow. She placed the deed envelope under the valise, not hidden from anyone in particular, only kept flat and safe. The awl she laid within reach of her right hand. Darkness inside the Mercantile was not complete. It gathered in layers, blue at the windows, black under the counter, silver where rainlight held along the roof seams. The building settled around her with patient knocks and long wooden sighs. Once, near midnight, something shifted in the front room, and Hazel sat up holding the awl, listening until she understood it was only water releasing from a warped board into the pan below. She slept little. The floor was hard, the air raw, and her body could not yet believe it had permission to remain. But no one opened the door. No one told her to gather her things. No one stood above her with 8 exact words and a face turned away. Near dawn, the rain stopped. The river went on speaking. The Mercantile had been waiting, and so had she. By 7 that morning, Hazel had already learned which corner of the back room stayed dry. Water had gathered in 3 places overnight, each with its own sound. The pan under the roof seam caught single drops, clean and spaced, as though someone above were counting slowly. The rear window leaked in a thin line down the plaster, darkening it to the color of tea. Near the cellar door, damp had risen through the floorboards and left a dull bloom around the nail heads. Hazel tore narrow strips from the least useful grocery sack and laid them along the edges of the stains, making marks she could check after the next rain. The first 3 days became a study in limits. There was a well behind the building, half hidden in blackberry canes and capped with 2 weathered boards weighted by a stone. The pump handle beside it was iron, rusted at the hinge, and cold enough in the morning to sting her palm. She did not drink from it. She remembered the clerk's warning and respected it. But she cleared the weeds away, poured a little creek water over the hinge, worked the handle until brown water coughed up in spurts, and filled a bucket for washing the floor near the back door. The water smelled of metal and leaf rot. It had the color of weak coffee at first, then cleared enough for scrubbing. The outhouse stood 30 paces beyond the walnut trees. Lean but standing, its door marked with a crescent moon cut by a hand that had not owned a power saw. Inside were a warped seat, a coffee can full of lime hardened into a pale brick, and a wasp nest under the eave. Hazel did not disturb the nest while the air was cold. She cleaned the threshold with a stick, set a flat stone where mud was deepest, and made a note to buy lime when she had any right to buy anything. The floor demanded the most attention. During daylight she tested every path with the handle of the awl, tapping first, then setting only part of her weight down, then listening. A good board answered with a blunt wooden note. A doubtful board made a thinner sound. A dangerous one gave a damp inward sigh before the foot had settled. She tore labels from empty tins and wrote marks on them in pencil. Step, no, edge, and store. By the 3rd evening she had made a narrow, safe route from the back door to the work table, another from the work table to the stove, and a cautious arc around the front counter that let her pass near the register without touching it. She learned the creaks the way a mother learns a child's sleeping breath. The right side of the doorway clicked twice under the ball of the foot. The board beside the stove rose a hair when pressed at the end. The front room groaned in the late afternoon when the damp boards warmed and shifted. None of these sounds frightened her after she had named them. They became part of the building's language, not welcoming, not unkind, merely exact. On the 2nd day she found a public spigot beside the courthouse and filled 2 borrowed milk jugs that had been lying behind the Mercantile, rinsing them 7 times before trusting them. On the 3rd day she washed the front window from inside with a rag and a cup of gray well water, not to make it clean, which was beyond 1 cup, but to let enough light fall on the counter to work by. The glass was cracked in a long diagonal line, and every time she passed it, the world outside appeared divided into 2 pieces that almost met. That afternoon, with her list folded in her pocket and her last few coins tied in the corner of a handkerchief, she went to the hardware store. The sign above the door read Nash Hardware and Sopley and Paint, faded nearly to bone. A string of cowbells rang when she entered, and the smell inside was a comfort so sudden she had to stand still until it passed. Linseed oil, rope, galvanized metal, seed packets, sawdust, kerosene, new pine boards stacked flat on sawhorses. Along one wall, drawers held nails and screws by size, each drawer front blackened where hands had touched it for years. There were stovepipe elbows hung from hooks, garden rakes in a barrel, bags of mortar mix, axe handles, canning lids, lamp chimneys, gloves, mouse traps, work socks, and a glass case of pocket knives with yellowed price tags beneath them. Behind the counter stood the man she had seen lifting lime, older than he had looked through rain, with a gray mustache cut straight across and one eyebrow divided by a scar. His left thumb bent outward at the first joint, not useless, but altered by some earlier accident. He wore a red flannel shirt buttoned to the throat and suspenders dark with use. When he looked up, his eyes went to the list in her hand before they went to her face. "You are the one at Pike's," he said. "Yes, sir." "Everett Nash," he said. Though his name was on the window, the invoice pads, and the side of a delivery truck visible through the back door. "You need more than that paper says." Hazel handed him the list. He read it without moving his lips. Dust mask, gloves, stiff broom, scrub brush, bucket, lantern wick, mouse tins, lime, rope, chimney brush. He tapped the last item. "You cleaning that flue yourself?" "Yes, sir." "You ever cleaned a chimney?" "No, sir." He set the list on the counter and looked at her carefully, not in the way Raymond had looked, measuring what could be taken, but in the manner of a person measuring whether a shelf would hold. "Then you do not start on—" "I was not going to. That roof would punish haste." "I believe it." The corner of his mustache moved. Hazel untied the handkerchief and laid out what she could spend. Everett did not touch the coins. He reached beneath the counter, removed a ledger bound in black cloth, and opened it to a blank page near the back. "I can make an account. I do not have I did not ask if you had wages. I cannot promise quickly. I did not ask for quickly either." She stood with her hands at her sides, aware of the worn knees of her jeans, the cracked skin above her heels, the damp cuffs of her sleeves. Credit was a word that had followed trouble most of her life. It had sounded like traps, fees, penalties, papers signed by people who did not understand them until the understanding cost more than the original debt. Everett must have seen some of that caution, because he turned the ledger around and wrote only her name, the property, and a limit of $25. "No interest," he said. "No account fee. No late charge. You pay when you sell something or work something or decide to walk away and bring back what is unused." "I do not want charity." "Good. I am poor at charity." He pulled a thin, stained paperback from a shelf behind him and set it beside the ledger. "This is a manual. Home repairs for rural structures. 1974. Chapter 7 has flues. Chapter 2 has sill warnings. Ignore the electrical section unless you want to meet God ahead of schedule." Hazel opened the book. The pages smelled of dust and oil, and several corners had been folded by other hands. "How much is it?" "It came free with a shipment before you were born." "That does not make it free now." "It does if I say it does." They looked at one another across the counter. Then Hazel nodded once, not gratefully in a large way, only with enough respect not to make his offer smaller by refusing it. He gathered what she needed with slow economy. The prices he wrote were plain. 1 pair canvas work gloves, $3.25. 2 paper dust masks, 45 cents each. Stiff corn broom, $4.80. Second-hand galvanized bucket, $1.50. Masonry hand brush, $2.10. 6-inch round wire chimney brush, used, $3. 2 fiberglass rods, rental, $5 deposit. Coil of 1/4-inch rope, 20 feet, $2.60. Small bag hydrated lime, $1.75. Mouseproof tin with tight lid, 75 cents. Lamp wick, 30 cents. 1 flat tin of stove blacking, 90 cents. 3 ounces light machine oil in a glass bottle, 60 cents. He added the figures twice, then crossed out the rental deposit and wrote due back beside brush. $17.85, he said. Less what you have. Hazel paid him what she could. He recorded the rest without comment. Before she left, he came around the counter and showed her how to join the rods without cross-threading them. His hands were large, but they handled the ferrules with a watchmaker's patience. Never force a thread, he said. Metal remembers insult. Hazel almost smiled, because Lorna would have liked him for that sentence. The manual became her second voice. That night she read Chapter 7 beside the backroom window until dusk took the print away. She read it again the next morning over cold beans. Then she carried the book to the stove, set it on a crate, and followed its instructions in order, adding what common sense required where the diagrams assumed a stronger roof in a cleaner house. First she cleared the area around the stove, moving mouse-chewed boxes away from any future spark. She laid damp rags over the floor seams and placed the pan beneath the pipe opening. She removed the length of loose stovepipe by turning it slowly rather than pulling, catching a fall of black scale in the bucket. Creosote came down in curled flakes, glossy as burned sugar in some places, powdery as soot in others. It smelled sharp, bitter, and oily, a smell that stayed in the nose long after she stepped outside. She did not climb the roof. Instead, she worked from below, feeding the round wire brush up through the throat of the flue one rod at a time. The first push stopped after 2 feet. She lowered the brush, turned it, raised it again, and felt the blockage give in small reluctant bites. She worked in strokes no longer than the manual advised, up and down, not twisting too hard, not letting the rod bend against the brick. Each foot gained was marked in pencil on the wall. 3 feet. 4. 6. Then the brush struck a nest. The nest had been abandoned, made of twigs, leaves, insulation fibers, and the pale skeletons of insects. It came down in handfuls after an hour of scraping. Hazel wore one mask until it darkened and the second until the paper softened from her breath. Her arms shook by noon. By 2 o'clock, her shoulders burned each time she lifted the rod. At 4, a shaft of clearer air touched her face through the stove opening, cold and sudden, carrying the river smell down the flue. That was hope, but she did not mistake it for completion. She tied the rope to the brush handle and worked the flue again, shorter strokes now, drawing loose scale from the smoke shelf in the bend where soot had banked like river silt. She cleaned the stovepipe outdoors with the masonry brush, knocking creosote into a pit she dug near the outhouse and covering it with damp soil. She checked the pipe seam by holding it to the light. She wiped the stove door gasket with a rag until it no longer shed black onto her fingers. She cleared the firebox, removed fallen mortar, and used a mirror shard to look up into the draw. It took 13 hours across 2 days. On the third evening, after returning the rods to Everett and receiving only a nod, she bought a single onion from the grocery and accepted 2 split sticks of kindling from the cafe owner, who said they had been cluttering the back step. Hazel did not argue with the wording. She carried them home under her arm as carefully as flowers. The first fire was no larger than a hat. She twisted paper from an empty flour sack, laid the smallest sticks over it, opened the draft, and struck a match with both hands cupped around the flame. Smoke hesitated at the stove mouth, then lifted. Hazel waited with one hand on the door latch, ready to smother it. The smoke climbed again, smoother this time, and the kindling caught with a low, clean crackle. She fed one thumb-thick stick. Then another. Heat touched the fronts of her knees. Outside, evening dropped blue over the walnuts. Inside, the stove gave back around, humble warmth that seemed too large for so little flame. Hazel set the wash can on top with water, sliced the onion into it with her pocket knife, and added beans from the last packet a pantry woman had given her. The meal had no fat, no salt beyond what remained in the can, and no beauty except steam. Still, when she lifted the first spoonful to her mouth, the heat traveled down through her chest and opened a space there that had been clenched for weeks. She ate sitting on the floor with her back against the work-table leg. The firelight made the room less ruined without pretending it was whole. The stove ticked. The river moved. A mouse worked somewhere behind the wall, disapproving of her tenancy. After the chimney, she began the workroom inventory in earnest. She made columns on the backs of torn ledger covers. Useful. Repair. Sell. Burn. Hunt. The act of naming steadied her. On the first shelf she found 6 glass apothecary jars, 2 with corks fused in place. 1 cracked around the shoulder, 3 sound. A bundle of square nails wrapped in a 1909 newspaper. 2 brass drawer pulls, not matching. A hand scale without its pan. 4 scale weights, 1 ounce, 2 ounce, 8 ounce, and 1 pound, all stamped with small crown numbers. A jar of mismatched screws in which she found 6 good slotted brass screws and separated them by length. On the second shelf were dry goods remnants gone to dust, paper labels from coffee tins, a faded ribbon spool, half a box of lamp chimneys nested in straw, and a stack of blank receipt slips printed with the Mercantile name. The slips were water-stained along one edge, but the top halves could be used. Hazel pressed them beneath a board to flatten. Under the table she found a treadle base without its top, a broken crate of horseshoe nails, a box of porcelain knobs, 2 cracked insulators, and a cast-iron coffee grinder so stiff with hardened oil that the handle would not turn. She set the grinder under repair, not because she needed coffee, but because frozen mechanisms deserved an honest attempt. The drawers took most of a day. 1 held chalk, red twine, dried sealing wax, 3 pen nibs, and a lump of something that had once been an eraser. Another held advertisements for patent medicines that promised relief in language so confident it seemed almost sinful. The bottom drawer stuck halfway. Hazel did not pull. She removed the drawer above it, reached down, found the obstruction by touch, and lifted out a wooden yardstick that had fallen behind the runners. The bottom drawer then opened with a sigh. Inside lay a black account book. Its cover was rubbed nearly smooth. On the first page, written in brown ink, were the words Town Accounts and Sundries. The dates began in the late 19th century and ran forward in careful columns. Names filled the pages. Families, miners, widows, ranch hands, the school teacher, the undertaker, the liveryman, a doctor, 3 Chinese names written with uncertain spelling, and several entries marked only by initials. Beside each were amounts, goods, dates, payments, and sometimes one small word in the margin, kept. Hazel did not read far. Not then. Account books were not casual things. They held hunger, pride, promises, shame, and mercy in the same hand. She wrapped the book in a dry cloth and set it on the upper shelf where mice could not reach. Only when the room had been ordered enough to breathe did she return to the brass register. It sat on the counter where she had lifted it with great effort from the floor, sliding a board beneath one side. Then another, making a ramp because dragging it would have wounded both the machine and the boards. It must have weighed more than 80 pounds. The base was oak, darkened by damp, with brass panels bolted over the sides. The maker's plate had been nearly black when she began, but after 2 hours with a dry cloth and 1 drop of oil on the screw heads, she could read part of it. National Cash Register Co., Dayton, Ohio. The drawer would not open. The crank would not move. 3 keys were depressed and held there by time. Hazel did not mind that. Machines had reasons. She began with sound. Using the pearwood awl handle, she tapped the side panels, the back plate, the drawer front, the base, and the underside as far as she could reach. Most places answered with the dense note of metal fastened over wood. The right underside gave a different sound. Lower. Deeper. Not hollow exactly, but interrupted, as if a second surface lay above the first. She repeated the test. Same note. Then wait. An empty register of that size would be heavy, but its weight should have rested forward, toward the drawer and mechanism. This one settled backward. When she lifted one front corner with a pry stick and a folded rag, the rear did not respond as it should. Something inside the base held mass where no mechanism belonged. She cleared the counter, set the manual under one corner to level the register, and examined the underside by lamplight. There, beneath a hardened skin of dust and old grease, was a round cedar disc no wider than a silver dollar. It had been set into the oak base with such care the grain nearly concealed its edge. The disc was not a plug a repairman would use. It was a secret meant to look like a knot. Hazel sat back. The room seemed to become still around the register. Not silent. The stove ticked, the river continued, one loose sheet of paper lifted at the edge when wind found a seam. But something in her attention narrowed until only the cedar circle remained. She did not pry it out. She cleaned around it with a dry toothbrush from her valise. She touched the seam with the awl point and felt a minute give. She warmed a drop of machine oil between her fingers and placed it along the edge with a sliver of paper. Then she waited while the oil moved where it wanted. Waiting had become one of her more reliable tools. After an hour, the disc turned under gentle pressure. Not much. A hair first. Then another. Beneath it was a brass screw with a slotted head, blackened but cleanly cut. Hazel chose the right screwdriver from a drawer of mismatched tools, filed its tip flat against a stone because it had been rounded by misuse, and seated it in the slot. She pressed down hard, turned slowly, and felt the screw break free without damage. The false bottom did not spring open. Nothing in that building performed. A narrow oak plate loosened under the base, then slid toward the back only after she found 2 more screws concealed beneath dirt and a strip of felt. The movement was less than an inch at first. A smell came out through the seam. Dry cedar, metal, paper, and a faint old sweetness like tobacco leaf. Hazel stopped, drew one breath, and moved the lamp closer. Inside the base, packed as carefully as goods in a winter trunk, were several parcels wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cotton tape gone brown at the edges. There was also a tin box no larger than a brick, a leather pouch stiff with age, and a long, flat packet sealed in wax. On top of everything lay a folded paper label. Do not hurry. The words were written in a hand she did not know, but the instruction belonged to every good lesson she had ever received. Hazel obeyed. She removed the first parcel and set it on a clean flour sack. The cotton tape resisted, then untied in one piece. Inside the oilcloth was a roll of chamois leather holding tools, 2 jeweler's screwdrivers, a spring hook, a pin vise, 3 steel picks, a brass oiler with a needle spout, a bone folder, a narrow awl finer than Lorna's, and a pair of tweezers with tips so exact they met like closed lips. Each tool had been wiped before storage. Each had a place sewn into the leather. This was not a set abandoned by carelessness. It had been put away by someone who expected a worthy hand later. The second parcel held raw materials. Thin brass sheet, linen thread, small squares of bookboard, a twist of copper wire, 3 sticks of sealing wax, a packet of ledger paper wrapped in blue tissue, a corked bottle of dried shellac flake, amber as trapped honey. Beneath them lay 4 blank brass key tags, each one stamped only with a tiny balance scale. The third parcel was heavier. When Hazel opened it, coins slid against one another with a muted, unmistakable sound. She sat very still. Gold has a color unlike brass when lamplight finds it. Brass reflects the room. Gold seems to hold a private sun, even when dulled by fingerprints and years. The coins lay wrapped in muslin rolls, separated by paper slips. Liberty Head double eagles. St. Gaudens double eagles. Fewer of them, bright at the high points. Indian head eagles. Half eagles. A small stack of quarter eagles. Morgan silver dollars in a separate roll, their faces rubbed by circulation. Barber halves and quarters. 3 Indian head cents folded into a corner as if someone had disliked leaving any count uneven. Hazel did not let herself imagine what they might buy. Imagination was dangerous near money. She did what she knew. She counted. First by type. Then by denomination. Then by date. Then again by face value. She made columns on the back of a receipt slip, sharpened the pencil with her pocket knife, and kept her numbers small and square. 21 Liberty Head double eagles. 9 St. Gaudens double eagles. 17 Indian head eagles. 33 half eagles. 12 quarter eagles. 46 Morgan dollars. 22 barber halves. 17 barber quarters. 3 Indian head cents. At old face value, the coins came to $871.28. That number alone would have been impossible enough. But face value was not worth. Hazel knew dates, mint marks, condition, and scarcity the way some people knew hymns. She did not pretend to appraise what needed an honest professional, yet she could see enough to know the range. The 1893 Morgan made her stop breathing for 3 counts. A Carson City mark on 1 double eagle made her set the coin down and fold her hands until they steadied. Several pieces were worn nearly smooth, but others had slept through decades untouched. By the careful, conservative arithmetic Lorna had taught her, the cash could stand near $55,000. Hazel wrote the figure only once, in pencil so light it could almost be a shadow. $55,042.73 estimated. Then she crossed out the word estimated and wrote possible. It was the only honest word. The leather pouch held no money. Inside was a military medal on a faded ribbon, wrapped in a handkerchief browned along the folds. The bronze disc bore a standing figure in the year 1918, with the ribbon's colors nearly lost to time. Hazel did not know the exact award. She knew only that it had belonged to someone whose name was not yet known to her, and that medals, like ledgers, should not be handled casually. She placed it beside the tools and covered it with the handkerchief again. The tin box came last. Its lid had been sealed with a strip of wax and tied once around with linen thread. Hazel held it under the lamp and saw that someone had written on the top in ink, now faded to brown, "For the one who opens this after us." Her thumb rested on the thread. She could have opened it. The room was warm. The door was bolted with a board she had fitted across the brackets. The rain had stopped. No living person stood there to forbid her. But the day had become too large, and the mind, like a floorboard, has limits before it gives. She set the tin box on the upper shelf beside the town account book. She placed the coins back in their muslin rolls, then inside a flour tin, then under the loose brick behind the stove where the mortar had already failed. It was not a clever hiding place, but it was dry and near where she slept. The tools she wrapped again, though she kept the brass oiler out, because some objects announced their usefulness at once. The raw materials went into the mouse-proof tin. The metal stayed covered. Only after all of that did she stand, lift the lamp, and walk outside through the back door. The night was clear. Clouds had moved east, and the mountain air had sharpened around the edges. Stars showed between the walnut branches. The river beyond the dark bank ran full with snowmelt, pale where it struck stone, black where it deepened under roots. Hazel walked to the place where she could see it through the trees and stood with her arms folded around herself. Not from cold alone. Water kept moving whether men found gold or lost it, whether stores opened or failed, whether names remained in ledgers or wore away from signs. It carried no debt forward except gravity. Behind her, the Mercantile stood without a light in its front windows. Inside were coins she had not sought, a ledger she had not read, a medal she had not named, and a letter she had not opened. The knowledge of them did not make the building safer. It did not mend the roof or test the well or soften the floor beneath her blanket. It did not return anything that had been taken. It only placed a hand, firm and careful, against the door of tomorrow. Hazel stayed by the water until her fingers numbed. Then she went back inside, laid the unopened tin box beside the account book, and slept with the awl within reach. The Mercantile had been waiting, and so had she. Morning came without softness, pale through the cracked front window and gray along the counter where the brass register sat open-mouthed over its secret. Hazel woke before the stove had entirely surrendered its heat. The ashes still held a red seam under their powder, and the back room smelled of charred cedar, damp wool, and metal warmed and cooled again. For several minutes she did not rise. She lay under her jacket with one hand resting on the pearwood awl, watching daylight gather along the underside of the work table. The building had made no claim on her during the night. No beam had shifted beyond its usual language. No stranger had come to the door. The things she had found remained where she had placed them, not vanished, not explained. When she stood, her knees ached from the floor. She fed the stove 2 sticks no thicker than kindling, enough to boil water but not enough to pretend at comfort. Then she took the tin box from the upper shelf and set it on the cleared work table beside the account book. The wax seal had darkened with age. The linen thread around it was brittle. Under the morning light, the handwriting on the lid showed more clearly than it had by lamp. For the one who opens this after us. Hazel touched the words with one finger and felt the room alter in a manner too slight for sound. She had seen that angle of writing before. Not the exact hand, but its habit. A downward pull on the F. A careful, lifted S. Numbers made square at the corners as if they had been built rather than written. Lorna had written price tags that way, not because this was her hand, but because somebody before her had taught somebody before her the same discipline of mark and measure. The recognition did not strike. It settled. Hazel warmed the wax between her palms until it softened enough to crack without tearing the paper below. She loosened the thread with the tip of the awl and laid it aside. Inside the tin, wrapped in blue tissue, was a letter folded in 4 along creases so clean they had become part of the paper. Beneath it lay a flat candle the color of dark cream, wrapped in parchment, and a brass key tag stamped with a balance scale. She unfolded the letter. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened this box, Then our hands have reached one another by a road I could not see from where I sit. I am writing at the kitchen table in the back room of Pike & Sons Mercantile on the 15th day of October, 1952. Dr. Elias R. Menard of Sacramento has told me the growth in my stomach will not be cut out cleanly, and he has been kind enough not to dress the truth in Sunday clothes. I have some months, perhaps fewer. My strength is uneven, so I am putting in writing what my voice may not be able to carry when the time comes. My name is Mabel Armitage Pike. I was born in 1889 in Sierra City and raised in this store after my mother died. My father was Amos Pike, born in 1856 in Downieville, who kept the counter, the scales, the mule accounts, and the winter credit. His mother was Eliza Wren Pike, born in 1832 in St. Austell, Cornwall, who crossed the plains with a chest of tinware and a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Her father, Thomas Wren, born in 1804 near Truro, had kept account books for miners before ever seeing California. Before him there was only a name in an English parish register and a line of small tradesmen who believed a measure should be true even when the customer was poor. I write these names because names grow thin when no one says them. This store was not made rich by gold. It was kept by flour, lamp oil, boot nails, coffee, wire, soap, axle grease, thread, salt pork, school slates, and honest columns. We extended credit when the river was high, when snow cut the road, when a baby came early, when a husband was buried before the bill came due. That mercy was our strength and, in the end, our undoing. The trade closed on November 29th, 1929, the Friday after Thanksgiving. That morning I opened the shutters and found 6 men waiting under the porch, each holding a debt slip he could not pay. By noon there were 14. By evening, Amos was gone 10 years. My husband's lungs were failing, and the bank in Nevada City had written that our note would not be renewed. I locked the drawer with $3.19 inside, swept the floor, and turned aside to close it. No one shouted. That was the mercy of it. The town was ashamed, and shame makes careful footsteps. For more than 30 years, I have kept silence over what is hidden here. I did not hide it to grow rich. I hid it because panic spends quickly and grief spends poorly. Some coins came from my father's reserve. Some from repayments made long after we had marked the accounts forgiven. Some from men who returned after the war and pressed gold into my hand because they could not bear to see their names left open. I put the money away for a later daughter, or niece, or stranger with our carefulness in her hands. War has taken much from this house. My husband, Nathaniel Pike, came back from the Great War with his breathing ruined by gas near the Meuse-Argonne in 1918 and died by inches afterward. My brother Silas was buried in France and never saw the walnut trees leaf again. My son Edward joined the Navy in 1942 and was lost in the Pacific before he had a child to carry his name. I do not write this to make sorrow larger. I write it because the metal in the pouch belongs to Nathaniel, and it should not be sold for roof tar or groceries unless hunger leaves no other door. If you mean to use the tools, use them slowly. The ledgers are to be mended with wheat paste mixed 3 parts flour to 10 parts water, cooked at 170 degrees until it turns clear, then cooled under cloth. Line and thread should be drawn through beeswax once, not twice, or it will cut the paper. Shellac flakes dissolve best 1 part flakes to 4 parts alcohol by weight. Let them stand overnight and strain through muslin. For brass tags, anneal the sheet only to a dull red, never bright, then quench and file the edge in one direction. Clean with vinegar and salt, 2 spoonfuls to a cup. No longer than 8 minutes. Then rinse and dry near the stove, not on it. If you repair the cash register, oil only the pivots, never the teeth. Teeth need cleaning, not mercy. Let every coat dry a full day. Let every figure prove itself twice. You may find the town account book. Read it without judgment. A ledger tells what was owed, but not always what was carried. Some debts were paid in cordwood. Nursing, a repaired roof, a winter burial, or a pie left without a name. If you can, keep the book in the house. It belongs to the place more than to the blood. Inheritance is not the same as possession. Possession says, "This is mine." Inheritance asks, "What has been trusted to me?" If you have arrived here poor, ashamed, frightened, or empty-handed, do not despise that condition. Empty hands can receive without dropping what is given. Begin with the roof, then the chimney, then the floor under your feet. A house forgives neglect by inches, not speeches. There is a marker out back if the walnut still stands. Look for the horseshoe set into the trunk above shoulder height. Nathaniel put it there the summer before he left for training. Beneath that tree we said most of what mattered and failed to say the rest. I have left one candle from our last Christmas together. Light it when you need a witness that someone was here before you and wanted you to stay. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Mabel Armitage Pike. October 15, 1952. Hazel read the last line and did not move. The stove clicked once as metal cooled at the edge of the firebox. Morning had strengthened while she read, laying a long band of light across the work table. Over the blue tissue, the thread, the broken seal, and the letter resting beneath her hands. Her fingers were not shaking now. That would have been easier. Instead, they had gone very still, as if they had been instructed by someone older than memory. She read the letter again. The second reading was slower. Names entered differently the second time. Amos, Eliza, Thomas, Nathaniel, Silas, Edward. They no longer seemed like information. They stood in the room with their work aprons, account books, bad lungs, and unfinished bills. Hazel paused over the date the trade closed and imagined the men beneath the porch holding paper they could not honor, snow not yet fallen but already promised by the air. She paused over the instructions, tracing the ratios with the same care she would give a recipe for bread or mortar. She paused longest over the sentence about empty hands. When she was finished, she folded the paper along its original creases. Not new creases, not easier ones. She pressed the lines gently with the side of her thumb, returning the letter to the form in which it had waited. Then she placed it back on the blue tissue, not inside the tin yet, and took up the candle. It was wrapped in parchment browned at the folds. The wax had clouded on the surface but had not cracked. Its wick lay flat and dark against the top. The candle was broader than the narrow tapers sold in stores, hand-poured into a shallow mold, with a slight unevenness at one edge where wax had cooled against metal. It smelled faintly of beeswax and storage. Hazel carried the letter, the candle, and the brass key tag to the back door. She stepped down into the wet yard, past the pump, past the blackberry canes, past the place where the ground sloped toward the walnut trees. The morning was cold enough to show her breath. Jays scolded from somewhere near the neighbor's fence. A truck moved on the road beyond the Mercantile and then passed out of hearing. The 3 walnuts stood in a line, but only the middle one had the girth described by the letter. Hazel walked around it slowly. Bark rose in ridges, deep gray and rough under her palm. Moss had gathered on the north side. A scar from a long ago limb had folded over itself like a closed eye. At first she saw nothing. Then, above shoulder height and partly swallowed by living wood, she found iron. The horseshoe had been set open end up, its curve dark with rust. Its nails vanished beneath bark that had grown around them for decades. The tree had not rejected it. It had carried it forward. One side of the shoe had almost disappeared into the trunk, but the top arc remained, rough and unmistakable, holding a little rainwater in its hollow. Hazel stood beneath it and laid her hand flat against the bark. There were no words equal to that contact, so she did not search for any. She only stayed while cold moved through her sleeves and the river sounded beyond the bank. Above her hand, the horseshoe held its fixed curve. Below it, roots went into soil no record had fully named. When she returned inside, the back room had taken on the plainness of morning work again. The floor needed sweeping. The stove needed tending. The wall near the window had darkened further from last night's damp. The letter had not changed any of that. Yet the labor before her no longer felt like trespass upon a stranger's ruin. It had become instruction. She set the candle in a saucer found among the shelves, trimming the wick with her pocket knife only enough to free it. She waited until the stove had caught and the draft was steady, then touched a sliver of kindling to the coals. The flame took, small and blue at first. She carried it cupped in one hand and lit the candle. For a moment the wick refused. Then it accepted fire. The scent of beeswax lifted into the room, warm and faintly floral, mingling with smoke, pine, and damp plaster. The flame was modest, no taller than the width of her thumb, but it changed the work table more than the morning had done. Brass edges warmed in its light. The account book's rubbed cover showed a brown undertone. The tools in their chamois roll seemed not displayed, but returned. Hazel placed Nathaniel's medal beside the candle, still on its handkerchief. She did not polish it. She did not lift the ribbon. Some things needed witness before handling. Then, because the letter had told her to begin not with wonder but with work, she opened the Rural Repair Manual to Chapter 2 and placed Mabel's folded instructions beside it. Roof, chimney, floor. She wrote those 3 words on a receipt slip and pinned it to the wall with a rusted tack. Under them, after a pause, she added, well, windows, ledger, register. The candle burned for 1 hour and 12 minutes before she pinched it out with damp fingers to save the rest. Its smoke rose in a single dark thread and disappeared near the low ceiling. Only then did the kindnesses of the road come back to her, not as grand deliverance, but as small, exact bridges laid one after another over ground she could not have crossed alone. The bus driver with the paper cup of water, Miriam Calkins with her red pencil map and warnings that sounded like scolding, but were shaped like care. Everett Nash writing a credit account without interest and giving her a manual whose margins smelled of oil. The cafe woman who called kindling clutter so Hazel could accept it with dignity. Even the woman in the yellow raincoat, lifting one hand across a fence, had placed Hazel inside the town's weather for 1 second, instead of outside it. None of them had saved her entire life. Perhaps no one can do that for another person. They had only passed her 1 drink, 1 map, 1 tool, 1 flame's beginning, 1 gesture from a yard. But small kindnesses are sometimes the only planks across a washed-out place. A person steps where the next board holds, then the next, and afterward calls it endurance because the word mercy feels too exposed. And if you are watching this tonight from a chair near a lamp, or from a kitchen where the dishes are waiting, Maybe you remember such a plank in your own life. Someone who gave you a ride without asking the whole story. Someone who wrote your name carefully when you had begun to feel erased. Someone who handed you food and called it extra. Someone who waited beside you in silence because advice would have been too heavy. Tell us in the comments, if you can, about one small kindness you once received and never forgot. Not the polished version. The true one. The cup of water. The map. The door held open. These are the records that do not always make ledgers, yet they keep people alive all the same. That evening Hazel did not open the account book again. She did not count the coins. She did not touch the register except to cover it with a clean cloth. The day had given enough, and enough, when recognized, has its own boundary. She wrapped the letter in its blue tissue and returned it to the tin without sealing it. She placed the chamois roll of tools beside her folded shirt, the brass key tag on top of the manual, and the metal near the wall where no draft could reach it. The candle, shortened by its first burning in more than half a century, she set on the shelf above her sleeping place. Before lying down, she banked the fire carefully, checked the back door board, and listened to the front room. The building answered with its usual settling sounds, no more and no less. Outside, the river moved in the dark, carrying snowmelt over stone. Hazel slept with the heirlooms beside her, not like treasure, but like tools waiting for morning. On December 3rd, snow came before daylight and laid 4 inches across the porch boards, the service lane, and the broken-backed roof. She woke to the change in sound. Rain had always spoken against the Mercantile with many little fingers, but snow made the whole building listen inward. The river was still there below the bank, roughened by cold, yet the town above it had gone muffled. Even the road seemed to wait before letting a truck pass. When she opened the back door, the walnut branches were written in white, each dark twig carrying its narrow burden with a patience that felt almost stern. The roof could no longer be postponed. For 2 nights she read the roofing chapter 3 times, once by the last light at the window, once beside the stove with the manual propped against a flour tin, and once in the morning while steam rose from water warming in the washed bean can. The diagrams were plain, meant for farmers, widows, sons home from service, anyone with a ladder and more necessity than money. Still, she copied the measurements into her own columns. 30 feet across the front. 50 feet from false front wall to rear eave. Pitch shallow, nearly 4 and 12. 2 failed sections on the west slope. 1 long seam where corrugated metal had lifted above the older shakes. Rot at the left front corner. Tar patches useless. She did not mean to make the roof fine. Fine could come later, if later proved generous. First it needed to shed water and hold snow without surrender. At the hardware counter, she asked for the cheapest honest way, and Everett Nash looked at her list with his divided eyebrow lifting only once. He spread brown paper on the counter and drew the roof from above, his pencil making short workmanlike lines. "Not pretty," he said. "Dry. That's..." They calculated 3 bundles of cedar shingles for patching the exposed shake courses, 2 rolls of 30-pound roofing felt, a box of 1 1/4-inch galvanized roofing nails, a smaller handful of 2-inch nails for sistering boards, 2 tubes of roofing cement, and 4 8-foot lengths of 2x6 for rafters that could not be trusted alone. The west slope patch would need 12 feet by 16 feet covered, with enough overlap to carry the water past the broken seam. Felt would run horizontal. Lower course first, 6-inch overlap, never trusting gravity to forgive laziness. Everett wrote the prices in the ledger, then disappeared into the back room. He returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a square pole, a notched gauge, and a handle dark from more years of grip than any new tool could imitate. The head had been sharpened and oiled. A leather thong passed through the end of the handle. "My father's," he said. "He roofed half of Sierra County badly, and the other half well." She looked at the tool without reaching for it. "I cannot buy that. I did not price it. I could lose it." "You could." "Do not." He set it across the paper, ending the matter. The next morning, a man appeared at the service lane with a ladder on one shoulder and a coil of rope across the other. He was small-boned, nearly 80, with a face creased like dry creek mud and eyes the pale brown of weak tea. His cap had the name of a roofing company that had likely closed before she was born. He introduced himself as Arlen Voss and did not shake hands because both of his were full. "Everett says you are determined," he said. "I am trying to be useful." Useful as he would not take pay. He would not take coffee because she had none. He would accept hot water, bread if she had already eaten, and the right to tell her when she was wrong. Those were his terms. They worked 11 days, not all full days, because weather ruled the latter, and Arlen did not argue with weather. On the first morning he made her climb no higher than the porch roof and come down again 6 times, always facing the ladder, always with 3 points of contact, always slow. "Panic falls fast," he said. His teaching style had no padding. He tapped a nail head with one finger. "That nail's proud." She pulled it. He pointed to a chalk mark gone wavering across felt. "Line is drunk." She snapped it again. He watched her set a shingle. "Two." She moved it. By the 4th day, his short sentences had entered her hands. She sistered the first soft rafter by cutting a 2x6 to span past the rot, setting it tight against the original timber, clamping where she could, then fastening it with staggered 2-inch nails driven at angles that drew the new board close without splitting the old. Arlen made her pre-drill near the end grain. He made her test the bite with the claw of the hatchet. He made her understand that repair was not conquest. It was partnership with what had not yet failed. They worked by chalk line. 1 snap mark for the felt. 1 for the shingle exposure. 1 for the trim where the patch had to meet the old metal without making a pocket for water. The 3-stroke nail became a lesson in restraint. First tap to set. Second to seat. Third to finish. No wild hammering. No dented shingle. No bruised thumb if the hand paid attention. When snow returned on the 7th day, they came down before noon and spent the rest of the afternoon under the porch, sorting salvage cedar from boards too soft to keep. Arlen showed her how to smell rot before seeing it. Good cedar had a dry, peppery sweetness. Bad cedar smelled tired, like wet cardboard and mushrooms. On the 11th day, beneath a cold sun, the west slope held its new patch. The felt lay flat. The shingles stepped in even courses. The lifted metal seam had been bedded and nailed. Not beautiful, but honest. Water would run where it was told. Snow would have fewer places to enter. At the left front corner, the new sister rafter sat hidden under work that nobody passing on the road would praise because nobody passing on the road would see it. Arlen climbed down last, slower than he had climbed up that morning. He stood in the lane, looking at the roof with his hands hooked in his belt. "It will do," he said. From him, it sounded almost extravagant. She tried to return the hatchet to Everett that evening, cleaned, oiled, and wrapped in cloth. He looked at it, then at her. "Roof's not done being a..." "No, sir." "Then the hatchet's not done either." He wrote nothing in the ledger for that. By mid-December, the back room stayed dry through a night of rain. She woke 3 times expecting the pan's old count and heard only the stove ticking, the river beyond the wall, and the wind combing the walnut branches. There was still rot in the building, still no proper bed, still a demolition order pinned like winter over her calendar. But that morning the ceiling did not weep, and she allowed herself to stand beneath it for 1 whole minute without moving. January came iron cold. The chimney revealed its sickness after the roof stopped hiding it. Spalling bricks shed thin red faces into the snow. Mortar powdered under the touch of a gloved finger. At the crown, 2 bricks could be shifted by hand, and the flue tile showed a hairline crack where freeze had entered, widened, and returned year after year with patient violence. The stove still drew, but draw was not safety. A chimney could flatter a person for weeks before burning a house from inside its walls. She borrowed no courage for that work. She borrowed books. Everett found an old masonry pamphlet beneath a stack of stove catalogs and marked 3 pages with tobacco-brown fingers. Hydraulic lime for flexibility. Fireclay for heat near the flue. Sand sharp enough to hold, not beach soft and round. He sold her a small bag of hydraulic lime, a sack of clean masonry sand, and fireclay scooped from a torn bag into a paper sack and weighed on his produce scale. For the joints above the roofline, he said. Writing as he spoke, 1 part hydraulic lime, 2½ parts sand. Damp, not soupy. For firebox touch-up and flue collar, 1 part fireclay, 1 part lime, 3 parts sand. Small batches. It will lie to you in the bucket. How? Looks wet until it is too wet. She wrote that down. For 3 weeks she worked in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s, rising only enough by afternoon to make the snow soften on the sunny side of the lane. Every day began by warming water on the stove, then carrying it outside before it cooled. Mortar could not be mixed with ice-hearted water and expected to behave. She sifted sand through a scrap of screen, broke clumps with gloved fingers, and mixed in a dented pan, with a margin trowel Everett lent after making her promise to clean it before the mortar stiffened. Her hands suffered most. Gloves protected from abrasion but not from cold that came through damp lime and settled into the bones. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb, first at the tips, then down toward the knuckles, until the trowel seemed to belong to someone else. She learned to stop before clumsiness became damage. Inside, she held her hands near the stove, not too close, flexing them slowly as feeling returned in sharp little sparks. Then she went back out. She began by raking joints. Loose mortar had to be removed to sound depth, not merely skimmed for appearance. She used an old screwdriver ground into a narrow point, brushing each joint clean afterward. The dust fell red and gray into the snow below, where bricks had spalled beyond saving. Arlen helped her turn them, exposing the better face inward or outward depending on strength. He came only twice, declaring chimney work fussy as a judge, then stayed 3 hours each time. No stroke could be hurried. She dampened the brick with a brush so it would not steal water too quickly from the mortar. She pressed the mix in layers, compacting deep with the trowel edge, then striking the joint with a rounded tool made from a bent spoon handle. The line had to shed water without pretending to be new. Too proud, and frost would catch it. Too hollow, and rain would sit. At night she dreamed of joints. One morning the whole town seemed made of frozen breath. The pump handle wore a skin of ice. The black and tan dog from the first day appeared near the walnut trees, stood watching while she mixed mortar, then sneezed and left as if unimpressed. By noon she had repaired only 5 courses, but all 5 were sound. She wrote the date on the paper above the stove and crossed off another small square. Progress looked poor when measured by longing. It looked better by brick. Late in January, the test fire came. Everett stood outside where he could see the chimney crown. Arlen stood inside with his cap in both hands, though he would not admit concern if concern entered carrying a flag. She built the fire with paper, kindling, and one split log no thicker than her wrist. The stove smoked at the mouth for half a breath, then pulled clean. Flame climbed and settled. Heat entered the pipe. Outside, Everett watched the first thread of smoke lift straight, pale and untroubled into the cold air. Again, Arlen said. She opened the door, added a little more wood, and closed it without haste. The draw held. No smoke seeped at the collar. No smell of burning creosote entered the wall. 10 minutes passed. 20. The chimney warmed but did not complain. Everett came back inside rubbing his hands. "Clean," he said. She looked at the stove, at the repaired collar, at the mortar that would need weeks and years to prove itself fully, and felt the next room of winter unlock. That evening she cooked potatoes in a lidded pan borrowed from the cafe woman, who had sent them over in a paper bag with the words "too many" written across the front. The stove held a steady heat. The chimney carried smoke away. The back room filled with the smell of earth, salt, and iron warming in firelight. She ate slowly, listening to the flue do its work without praise. Late January brought the floor into full judgment. The roof no longer dripped over the worst seams, and the stove dried the back room enough to reveal what was damage and what had only been damp. The original boards were white pine, 12 to 16 inches wide in places, cut long and laid with a confidence modern lumber did not often show. Their surfaces were gray, ridged, splintered, and stained almost black near the old counterpath. Hand-cut rosehead nails held them down, irregular heads catching the light like small hammered stars. She rented a random orbit sander from Everett for $14 a day, paying part of it by sorting a cabinet of mixed hinge screws in his back room after closing. He watched her separate steel from brass, slotted from Phillips, usable from stripped, and said nothing until the final tin was labeled. "Lorna would have kept you," he said. It was the first time he used that name. She did not answer quickly. Then she said, "She tried." He nodded, and they closed the cabinet. The sander was heavier than it looked and less forgiving than a broom. Everett gave her 3 cautions. Keep it moving. Let the paper cut, not your shoulder. Do not chase every stain until you make a valley. She bought discs in 3 grits 80, 120, and 220. The floor had to be cleaned first. Nailheads set carefully with a punch, loose splinters trimmed, and gaps cleared of mouse leavings, grit, and old paper. The first pass with 80 grit changed the sound of the room. Dust lifted in pale clouds despite the cloth she tied over her nose. The sander hummed, wandered, and tugged as if the floor remembered every footstep and did not want them erased. She worked in rows, overlapping each pass, stopping often to sweep, kneel, and check the surface by touch. The gray lifted in patches. Beneath it appeared a dark honey color. Not fresh, not young, but warm as old bread. The second pass, 120, quieted the roughness. Boards that had looked separate began to speak together. Saw marks remained in low places. She left them. Black stains near the counter did not vanish, only softened. She left those too. A floor without memory would have been a lie. The final pass with 220 took most of a day and all of her shoulders. By evening she could slide her palm along the safer boards without catching splinters. The rose-head nails shone here and there through the dust, each one slightly different from the next. She swept 3 times, then wiped with barely damp cloths until the water came away less gray. Oil came next. Everett argued for tung oil cut thin for the first coat and linseed for warmth only if she accepted drying time like a commandment. She tested both on a board from under the counter where no one would see. In the end, she used a first coat of thin tung oil, rubbed in with cloth, wiped back after 20 minutes, then waited 48 hours while the room smelled nutty, sharp, and clean. The second coat deepened the color from dark honey toward chestnut. The third, touched with boiled linseed, brought out a mahogany cast in the boards near the stove, as if heat from 100 former winters had risen to meet it. The cure time taught obedience. 48 hours meant 48 hours. She walked only on planks laid like stepping stones where she had not oiled, and slept under the work table with the window cracked despite the cold. The room became both finished and unusable, which seemed a fair lesson in most forms of healing. Then came the bad morning. It followed no disaster large enough to justify it. The roof held. The chimney drew. The floor was taking oil beautifully. Yet she woke with a heaviness so complete that even lifting water to the stove felt like work assigned to a stranger. Her hands hurt. Her back hurt. The calendar looked less like progress than accusation. Outside, fog lay over the low ground, and the town sounds came faint and far away. She swept one corner badly, stopped, and knew the day would ruin whatever she forced through it. So she walked down past the walnut trees to the wet ground near the river bend, where reeds and winter grass held beads of fog. There was a marshy place there, not large, only a backwater where the river slowed after high flow. She sat on a stone with her coat wrapped tight and watched a great blue heron work the shallows. The bird moved with deliberate hunger. One foot lifted, hovered, entered the water without a ring, its neck folded and unfolded by old design. It did not hurry for the river, or the cold, or the fact that the whole world expected something from every living creature by noon. It waited, struck once, missed, then resumed its exact stillness. She did no work that day. Near evening she returned, ate potatoes warmed in the pan, checked the stove, and sat on the newly oiled floor where it had cured enough to bear her. The boards held her weight. The color held the light. The bad morning passed into the room without needing to be explained. The Mercantile had been waiting, and so had she. February opened with windows. There were 8 of them, not counting the small square opening above the back door that had been boarded over sometime during the county's long neglect. 3 had no glass at all, only plywood or feed sacks nailed over the sash. 4 were cracked in ways that admitted wind even when rain stayed out. 1, in the front room near the counter, held wavy original glass that Everett dated with a finger held behind it and a satisfied grunt. It had a seed bubble near the lower left corner and distorted the street beyond into a gentle ripple. "Do not replace that," he said. "I was not going." "Good. I did not want to dislike you." The original pane became the rule by which the other windows were judged. Save what could be saved. Replace only what weather had already taken. She removed each sash carefully. Numbering frame, sash, and stops in pencil before taking them apart. Old putty came away in flakes where it had dried to chalk, and in stubborn strips where some previous repair had been stronger than elegant. She used a heat gun borrowed from the newspaper office, held low and moving, careful not to blister the wood or crack surviving glass with sudden warmth. Glazing points came out with needle-nose pliers. Broken shards were wrapped in newspaper and placed in a crate-marked glass, because sharp things deserved labels. For replacement panes, Everett found salvage glass from a schoolhouse renovation stored behind his shop. Not perfect. Not modern smooth. Close enough to belong. He cut it himself on a felt-covered bench while she watched the oil-fed cutter score one clean line, then the glass part under his hands with a sound like ice deciding. The putty was DAP 33, a small tub with a skin that had to be folded back and sealed again after each use. Everett made her knead it until it warmed and softened. Too cold, and it crumbled. Too warm, and it smeared without discipline. She laid a thin bed along the rabbet, pressed the glass gently into place, set points every 8 inches, then rolled putty into a rope between her palms. The glazing knife had to ride at a steady angle, leaving a bevel that shed water and showed no ragged edge from inside. Her first line looked like a creek bank after flood. She scraped it out and began again. By the third window, her wrist understood what her mind had been arguing. Press, draw, lift at the corner, cut the excess clean. Dust with whiting where the oil shone too much. Leave it alone to skin before paint. Do not keep touching work because uncertainty itched. The sash cords were worse. The old ones had rotted inside the pockets, leaving counterweights fallen like iron fruit at the bottom of the frames. She opened the access panels with care, fishing out weights coated in dust and mouse hair. The new cord was 1/4-inch cotton, not nylon, because nylon would look wrong and slip differently through the pulleys. Everett sold it by the foot and made her tie the figure 8 knot 3 times on the counter before he let her take it. Again, he said after the first. She tied it. Dressed the knot. She tightened it neatly. Again, she tied it once more. At the window, the cord ran over the pulley, down to the weight, through the eye, around, and into the figure 8, dressed snug but not strangled. The weight had to hang free, not scrape the pocket. The sash had to rise without jumping and stay where the hand left it. When the first one did, she lowered and raised it 6 times, listening to the quiet travel of the weight hidden in the wall. The front original pane was last among the good ones. She did not remove the glass. She repaired the putty in place, working around the seed bubble as if around a sleeping animal. Outside, February light rested on the porch. Inside, the counter waited, the register under its cloth, the ledger above the shelf, and the floor dark beneath her knees. The final sash belonged to the back room, facing the walnut trees. Its lower rail had swollen, and one corner joint opened enough to show daylight. She cleaned the joint, worked warm hide glue into the seam with a sliver of card, clamped it square overnight, then replaced the missing pane the next morning. The putty line went down cleanly on the first attempt, not perfect, but no longer pleading. As she set the sash back into its frame, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It was a round, quick bird, black-capped and bright-eyed, light enough that the branch barely acknowledged it. It turned its head toward her through the new glass, tapped once at the air with its beak, then flicked away toward the river. The window held. No wind crossed the sill. The sash cord moved inside the wall with a soft, hidden certainty. She stood there with the glazing knife in one hand and cotton cord dust on her sleeve, looking out through a pane that made the world whole again, one careful repair at a time. Late February brought the walls into view. For months, Hazel had looked at the plaster without truly seeing it. The roof had demanded fear first, then the chimney, then the floor, then the windows with their drafts and broken mouths. But after the final sash held, the walls began to show their wounds honestly in the stronger light. The plaster was original in most places, horsehair mixed through lime and sand, pressed over hand-split oak lath that could still be seen where 3 patches had failed near the chimney. Those exposed strips were narrow, irregular, and darkened by years of stove heat. Each had been split by a blade, not sawn, so the plaster had once gripped them with thousands of small rough surfaces. The failed places were not large, but they were serious. One patch above the stove had loosened to a hollow drum. Another, along the corner where damp had traveled before the roof work, had cracked into islands. The third had fallen entirely behind the stovepipe, leaving lath furred with old hair, soot, and powdered lime. She did not want to disturb what still held. An old wall can be injured by vanity more than neglect. So she tapped with the handle of the awl, marked only the hollow edges, and cut back to sound plaster with a utility knife sharpened twice during the work. Everett found horsehair in the back of his storage loft, in a paper bag printed with the name of a plaster supply company that had closed sometime in the 1950s. He set it on the counter with a seriousness that made the bag feel ceremonial. "Do not sneeze into that," he said. "I will try not to." "Old hair travels!" It did. It clung to her cuffs, her apron, the cracks in her fingers. She mixed the scratch coat in a pan near the stove, lime putty, sharp sand, a pinch of fire clay near the chimney, and horsehair teased apart until it disappeared through the mixture like pale roots. The first coat had to be pushed hard through the lath gaps, not spread prettily over the surface. She pressed with the trowel until the plaster bulged behind the strips, forming keys that would hold after curing. Then she scored the face with horizontal scratches so the next coat would bite. The brown coat came 3 days later, 3/8 of an inch thick, built proud enough to meet the old wall, but not so proud it would need cruel sanding. She kept it damp with a brush, morning and evening, because lime cured by taking back air slowly, not by being rushed dry. 72 hours passed before she touched it again. During that time the patches changed color by degrees, from wet stone to pale clay, to something that belonged nearer the wall than the bucket. The finish coat was 1/8 of an inch. Finer sand. Less hair. A steadier wrist. She feathered its edges into the old plaster with a damp sponge, leaving a slight irregularity because the wall had never been machined and should not start lying now. When the final patch held under her palm, cool and firm, she stood back and looked at the 3 repaired places near the chimney. "These patches will hold another 100 years." She spoke the line low, not because she believed she could command time, but because the wall had earned a blessing in plain language. Doris Vale, who owned the cafe with the steamed windows, never called her help by its name. She left paper bags on the Mercantile's back step twice a week, sometimes at dawn, sometimes after lunch, sometimes in that hour near dusk when the whole town smelled of wet stone and stove smoke. The bags were always folded closed twice at the top and weighted with a clean jar or an onion so wind could not take them. Inside might be heel ends from bread loaves, potato peelings thick enough to fry, 2 cracked eggs in a coffee cup, soup bones, apples with bruises cut out, or once, on a morning so cold the pump handle froze to Hazel's glove, 4 cinnamon rolls hardened at the edges but fragrant with butter. The first time Hazel carried the bag back to the cafe and tried to pay, Doris did not look up from rolling pie dough. "No, I can put it on account. No, I have some coin." Doris set the rolling pin down. "In candles when the shop reopened." Hazel looked at the woman's floury hands, her broad shoulders, the pencil tucked into the knot of hair at the back of her head. Doris had the sternness of someone who fed people before forgiving them for needing food. Behind her, coffee cups hung from hooks, white plates warmed above the line, and a radio played so softly it seemed intended only for the stove. "I do not make candles." "You might." Then Doris returned to the dough, and the matter was filed under a future neither of them examined too closely. The bags continued. Hazel began leaving the jars rinsed and the paper folded flat in return. Once, she tucked a repaired drawer pull into a bag after Doris mentioned a cabinet that would not close. Another time she sharpened the cafe's paring knives on Everett stone and returned them wrapped in a towel. Doris accepted these repayments without comment. That was her kindness, too. Caleb Rowe arrived on a Saturday with a red Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul across the handlebars, and a face still deciding whether to be boyish or grown. He was 15, narrow at the wrists, with hair that fell into his eyes and ears reddened by cold. The bicycle's chrome was pitted, but its tires were sound, and he rode it as if every hill in town had made him a private challenge. Hazel heard the tires hiss through wet grit before she saw him. He stopped near the woodpile, set one foot down, and studied the stacked rounds beside the back wall. "You need those split smaller," he said. "I do. I cannot pay much." He lifted the maul from the handlebars. "My mother said." "About your grandfather." The sentence came out awkwardly, as if borrowed from an adult and carried too far by hand. Hazel did not correct the word. In Downieville, lineage had already begun to move through town by rumor, and rumor often simplified what history had made complicated. What mattered was not the accuracy, but the permission behind it. Somewhere, Caleb's mother had heard an old account, or a kindness, or a debt forgiven, and sent her son with a maul because a name in a ledger still had warmth in it. He split wood with more force than skill at first, burying the blade in rounds and wrenching it loose with his whole body. Hazel showed him how to read the checking in the grain, how to set the round on a chopping block, how to let the maul fall through a line already asking to open. He pretended not to be instructed. Then he adjusted his stance and split 3 clean pieces in a row. When she tried to hand him $2, he stepped back. "No. Mom. For your time." "No. For the bicycle tire, then." He shook his head, eyes on the ground. "Mom said no money." "Then what will you take?" He looked toward the stovepipe, the roof patch, the window glass catching weak sun. "You got any broken machines?" That afternoon he learned how to clean the coffee grinder's burrs with a brass brush and a toothpick, how to set screws in a saucer so they return to their own holes, and why hardened grease should be softened before being scraped. He asked few questions and remembered most answers. Before he rode away, the grinder handle turned half an inch farther than it had that morning. Reverend Boyd passed every morning at 8. He was not the kind of minister who entered by surprise with a casserole and a doctrine. He walked the road in a black coat greened at the cuffs, a wool scarf wrapped twice around his neck, and boots kept polished despite the mud. His church sat 2 streets over, white clapboard, narrow windows, bell quiet most days. Hazel saw him first from the front room while reglazing the original pane. He paused at the service lane, lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, and continued. The next morning he did the same. On the 3rd morning, she opened the door before he had passed. Cold entered around her ankles. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning. Miss Whitcomb." She did not ask how he knew her name. In a narrow town, names traveled faster than mail. After that, he tipped his hat each day and offered the same 4 words, never louder than weather required. Keep her in He did not ask which her. The building, the woman, the lineage, the town, the work. Perhaps prayer could hold more than one object without becoming vague. Hazel began to expect his passing the way she expected the stove's first tick after kindling caught. On the mornings when discouragement had laid itself across the threshold before she woke, those 4 words did not remove it. They only made room to step around. The cellar waited until February 11th. Hazel had known it would need to be opened, but knowing and doing are different labors. The door at the back room floor had been nailed shut with crossed planks, and she had left it that way through rain, snow, roof work, chimney work, and every night when the building's lower darkness felt larger than her lamp. By February, the upper rooms had enough order to bear the thought of what lay beneath them. She pried the boards carefully, saving the nails in a tin. The cellar door lifted only after she cleared the seam with a knife and worked the hinges with oil for 2 afternoons. When it opened, the smell came up cold and mineral, with a trace of old apples and stone damp. 7 granite steps descended into dark. They were narrow but sound, worn slightly at the center, each one cut by hand and set with more intention than beauty. The cellar measured 12 feet by 15 feet, with a fieldstone floor uneven underfoot and walls of dry-laid stone that had held winter for a century. Hazel carried the lantern down first, then stood on the bottom step until the room revealed itself. Shelves lined the north wall, mostly empty except for broken jars, a crate of rusted lids, and one stoneware crock with no crack in it. The air was colder than the room above, steady and settled. At the center of the fieldstone floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the rest. Its edges were straight. Its surface had been smoothed by tool marks so fine they could be seen only when lantern light crossed them sideways. Carved near one corner was the same balance scale mark stamped on the brass tags. The slab had no ring, no visible hinge, no invitation. It sat there with the composure of a fact withheld. Hazel crouched and brushed dust from the carving with her sleeve. Then she stood. There are doors a person opens because the day has come, and doors a person respects because the day has not. The granite slab belonged to the second kind. She did not lift it. She did not test its edge with the awl. She only noted its measurements, 3 feet by 2 feet, and drew the mark in her receipt book. On the way back up, the third stair caught her eye. Not the tread. The underside. A corner of wood showed where no wood should have been, wedged between the granite riser and the sidewall. She set the lantern on the step above, lay on one hip in the cold, and worked the object free with both hands. It was a small oak box, no longer than her forearm, darkened almost black by years in the cellar air. Its lid was swollen but not locked. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph wrapped in oiled paper. The key's bow was shaped like the balance scale. The photograph made her sit down on the stair. A young woman stood in front of the Mercantile when its siding still held paint and its porch posts stood straight. She was 25, perhaps, with dark hair pinned back, a long skirt dusted at the hem, and one hand resting on a brass tag press set upon the counter brought outside for light. Her face was not Hazel's face exactly. Time and blood do not make copies. But the set of the eyes, the line between concentration and patience, the mouth held closed as if saving words for use, all of it came near enough that Hazel felt the cellar air shorten. On the back, written in brown ink, were the words, Clara Wren Pike, daughter of Amos Pike, age 25, summer of 1903. Hazel carried the box upstairs slowly. She set the photograph on the mantel beside the candle and placed the brass key next to it. The key did not belong to the tin box. It did not fit the register panel, the back door, the cellar latch, or any drawer she tried before sense told her to stop trying. Its purpose remained elsewhere. That was allowed. By March, the snow began to retreat from the service lane in dirty, shrinking islands. The creak beyond the trees grew loud with snowmelt. Not the steady under-voice of winter, but a full-bodied rush that seemed to rearrange stones at night. The walnut catkins emerged, green and pendulous, stirring in wind that had lost its knife edge. Mud took the place of ice. Birds returned to the eaves with opinions. The town opened its doors earlier. Dora set pies on the sill to cool. Caleb came twice a week, sometimes to split wood, sometimes to sit on the porch step and work the coffee grinder handle back and forth until the burrs finally turned in a full, clean circle. Hazel did not begin the craft that spring. The tools were ready enough. The instructions waited. The brass tags had been cleaned, the ledger paper flattened, the shellac dissolved once in a small test batch and strained through muslin. The old account book read only in portions because a person could not take in so many lives at a sitting. But beginning required more than possession. It required a hand steadied by shelter, a roof no longer leaking over the table, a chimney cured through its first hard season, a floor that did not need daily suspicion, and a mind not always listening for the next loss at the door. She decided to spend one coin, but only one, and only after proper appraisal in Nevada City. Not the rare one. Not one tied to any obvious story. A common half-eagle, worn enough to have traveled through many hands, valuable enough to purchase materials without emptying the cache of its meaning. With that, she would order brass sheet of the right thickness, linen thread, beeswax, bookboard, good paper, and a small tag press if she could find one used. Until then she practiced on scraps, on cardboard, on salvaged wire, on ledger paper too damaged to preserve. Her first tags were crooked. Her first paste was lumpy. Her first shellac coat streaked where she had brushed twice after it began to set. The house did not scold her for that. It had survived worse than a crooked tag. On the first warm afternoon of April, Hazel opened the back window and let the room breathe. Sunlight entered across the oiled floor. The patched plaster near the chimney held its pale color. The stove stood black and quiet. On the mantel, the candle, the medal, the photograph of Clara, and the brass key made a small line of witnesses. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, the first finished piece left Hazel's hands and remained on the table until morning. It was not large. That mattered. Large work can hide confusion behind scale, but a small object has no room for dishonesty. She had made a bound-town account folio, 12 inches tall, 8 inches wide, its covers built from bookboard and linen, its spine reinforced with muslin, its corners protected by hand-cut brass caps filed smooth under lamplight. On the front she had fixed a brass tag stamped with the balance scale and the words DBTS kept.
Depths forgiven.
The letters were not machine perfect. One E sat a hair higher than the others. The spacing between the final 2 words had been measured twice and still carried the warmth of a human hand. Inside were copies, not originals, of selected ledger pages, each cleaned, flattened, and photographed at the county office with Miriam's permission. Hazel had transcribed the entries beneath them in pencil first, then ink, leaving margins wide enough for notes. Where payment had been made in labor, she wrote it plainly. Where an account had been crossed out without collection, she did not decorate it with moral language. Forgiven was enough. Kept was enough. The folio was part record, part repair, part apology to names that had been reduced to columns. The last coat of shellac dried without streaking because she had finally learned not to return to a surface after it had begun to close. The brass corners held. The spine opened cleanly. When she laid the folio on the counter and stepped back, the Mercantile was dark except for the stove and one oil lamp. Snow pressed against the windows. The river moved under ice shadows. Hazel looked at the work until her eyes watered from the smoke or the hour, then covered it with muslin and went to sleep on the narrow bed she had built against the back wall. The interior by then had not become charming in the way magazines use the word. It had become sound. The roof no longer bent under weather. The chimney drew through storms without complaint. The floor carried a low gloss where feet had polished the oil by use. The front counter had been cleaned but not sanded smooth, because the pale elbow marks along its edge belonged to men and women who had leaned there with flour money, bad news, winter lists, and children pulling at their sleeves. Shelves had been repaired with salvaged pine and labeled in Hazel's compact hand. One held candles from Doris's promised account, poured in small batches with beeswax bought from a beekeeper near Nevada City. One held repaired ledgers, blank folios, brass tags, linen thread, and narrow paper packets of graphite. One held nothing but the old scale weights and the hand scale after Caleb helped her fit a new pan. The cash register remained on the counter, restored only enough to open and close with respect. Its brass was not polished to a mirror. Hazel had cleaned the grime, not the age. The drawer bell rang softly now. A single modest note. After she freed the mechanism with oil, patience, and 3 evenings of careful language directed at no one. Beneath it, the false compartment had been lined with fresh cedar. It was empty for the moment, which seemed proper. Some spaces exist so the future has somewhere to enter. The brass key waited longer than any of them expected. It was Caleb who noticed the plate in the walnut tree. He was taller by then, his wrists less narrow, his bicycle replaced by an old pickup that coughed before starting and smelled of cold vinyl. He had come to help clear a limb after a wet snow, and while cutting deadwood near the horseshoe, he saw a greenish edge beneath a fold of bark. Not iron, not nail, brass. Hazel stood on a ladder while he held it. The horseshoe remained above shoulder height, half grown into the tree, rusted and solemn. Below its right curve, where bark had folded over a scar, a small brass plate had been set flush into the trunk so long ago that the living wood had made a lip around it. The plate bore the balance scale mark, almost lost under verdigris. At its center was a keyhole narrow as a whisper. She fetched the key from the mantel. It entered reluctantly, then turned. The plate opened outward on a hinge no wider than a finger, revealing a hollow chamber cut into old dead heartwood and lined with tin to keep out damp. Inside lay a folded flag and a note wrapped in oilcloth. The flag had 48 stars, arranged in even rows on a field faded to a deep, smoky blue. Its stripes had browned at the creases. It was small enough to have been carried, not flown from a pole. Hazel lifted it with both hands while Caleb stood below the ladder, suddenly quiet in the way young men become when history turns from schoolbook to cloth. The note was dated November 11, 1918. The hand was older than Mabel's, firmer, with ink that had browned but not failed. My dear child, if this flag is found, let it be known that I placed it here on the day the armistice was announced, when the church bell rang until the rope burned William Boyd's palms and the whole town stood in the street not knowing how to be glad without counting the absent. Nathaniel is still overseas as I write. Silas will not come home. I have folded this flag for the sons who left by rail and for the mothers who went back to their kitchens afterward, because bread does not wait for victory. Keep it dry. Keep it hidden until someone has the patience to find it. Do not let the loudest person own the memory. Eliza Wren Pike. Downieville, Armistice Day, 1918. Hazel read it once on the ladder, once on the ground, and once that night at the counter while snow slid from the roof in soft collapses. Eliza had been Mabel's grandmother. Clara's grandmother, too. The Cornish woman from the letter whose chest of tinware had crossed the plains. The flag had waited inside the living tree through fires, storms, highway work, children growing old, and the county's condemnation notices. Its hiding place had not been designed for discovery by force. It had required repair, seasons, a boy looking upward, and a key kept without knowing. The next Memorial Day, May 27, 2024, Hazel carried Nathaniel Pike's medal to Downieville Cemetery. The cemetery rose above town on ground that held sunlight longer than the street. Pines stood beyond the fence. Grass grew unevenly around stones tilted by frost. Roots and time. Reverend Boyd came with her, not to lead a ceremony, only to stand nearby. Miriam brought a copy of the military record she had helped request. Everett removed his cap. Doris brought no food, which was how Hazel knew she understood the day's shape. Nathaniel's marker was modest, his name weathered but readable. Hazel laid the medal on a square of clean cloth at the base, not leaving it there for theft or weather, only letting bronze meet stone while the church bell marked the hour down in town. She had learned enough by then to know the medal was a World War service medal. Not rare. Not worth more than story except to the family that had lacked hands to receive it. She read Nathaniel's name aloud once. Silas's too, though his body remained in foreign ground. Then she wrapped the medal again and carried it home. She spent almost none of the cash. 3 coins left the flour tin across those 2 winters. The worn half-eagle for materials. 1 common Morgan dollar, sold to buy the second-hand tag press from a retired printer in Grass Valley. 1 barber half, after appraisal, to pay county fees when the temporary repair stay became a certificate of occupancy for limited commercial use. A 4th coin nearly went during the month the well pump needed rebuilding, but Caleb and Everett found a used leather cup, a packing nut, and a length of pipe behind the hardware store, and the repair cost more labor than money. Hazel kept the coin. The rest she returned to a safer keeping place. Not a bank display box with velvet trays. Not a story for strangers to repeat over coffee until it became less true. She lined the cedar compartment beneath the register with fresh muslin, placed the rolls back in order, added a written inventory with dates and appraisal notes, and sealed a second copy in the county clerk's office. Miriam insisted the original dollar bill from the sale remain in her drawer until she retired. She said it had behaved well there. Hazel did not argue. The money became not escape, not indulgence, not proof that suffering had earned reward. It became reserve, roof against a storm not yet named, medicine if a body failed, legal help if the place ever needed defending, materials for work, and, written in Hazel's own hand on the inventory's final line, for the next one, if she arrives empty. The Mercantile reopened without a banner. No grand sign appeared in the newspaper. No ribbon crossed the porch. Doris placed an index card on the cafe corkboard between a notice for firewood and a piano tuner from Nevada City. Hand-bound ledger folios, brass tag, sandal tins, repair of small account books, Pike and Daughters Mercantile, open Saturdays. We either permitting. The first customer was a woman from Sierra City with her grandmother's recipe notebook wrapped in a dish towel. The cover had come loose, pages powdered with flour and cinnamon at the edges. Hazel repaired the spine with linen and wheat paste, made a brass label for the front, and charged less than the woman expected but more than pity would allow. The woman cried silently when she picked it up, pressing the book to her chest before placing it in her bag. After that came others. A miner's diary found in an attic. A box of receipts from a closed feed store. A family Bible with a cracked hinge. A school attendance ledger. a tin of letters tied with blue thread. Candles sold slowly at first, then steadily when Doris began burning one near the register in the cafe. By the second winter, Hazel had a mailing list of 43 names written on index cards and kept in a drawer arranged alphabetically, because digital lists felt too easy to lose without ashes or warning. On certain Saturdays, the store held only 3 visitors. On others, the bell above the door rang so often she had to let the stove burn low. No one called it successful in a loud way. That would have misunderstood it. The place was earning its own flour, oil, paper, wax, county fees, and winter firewood. That was a form of dignity older than applause. Caleb returned one April afternoon carrying a long object wrapped in a quilt. He was 17 then, with a nick on his chin from shaving and a steadier way of entering rooms. He had been taking carpentry jobs after school, repairing porch steps, building chicken coops, fixing sagging gates for people who paid in cash or jars or advice. Hazel had not seen the object before, but she knew from the careful embarrassment in his face that he had made it where she could not correct him early. He laid it across the counter and unwrapped the quilt. It was a wooden sign, hand-carved from walnut, the letters cut deep and plain, not decorative, not showy. The board still held a natural curve along one edge. He had oiled it until the grain rose dark and warm. Across its face were the words, Pike and Daughters Mercantile. Hazel looked at the plural. Caleb pretended to examine a shelf. I checked the old sign, he said. It said Sons. I remember. He rubbed one thumb along a small tool mark near the S. Thought it was wrong. The store was very still around that sentence. Outside, spring rain moved through the walnut leaves. The brass register sat between them, its drawer closed, its secret returned beneath it. On the wall behind the counter hung the photograph of Clara Wren Pike, age 25, holding the tag press before the Mercantile. The candle from Mabel had burned down to its last inch and was never lit now except on the 15th of October. Eliza's folded flag rested in an archival box on the upper shelf. Wrapped in cotton, its note copied and placed beside it. Hazel ran her fingers over the carved letters. The word daughters held not only blood. It held Mabel, Clara, Eliza, Lorna, Doris with her paper bags, Miriam with her stamp, the recipe book woman, the next empty-handed person who might come through a door with more fear than money. It held anyone taught to keep, mend, measure, forgive, and begin again without applause. How much do I owe you? She asked. Caleb shook his head. No. Then what? He looked at the coffee grinder on the shelf, the one he had helped bring back to life piece by piece. When you teach the binding class, he said, I get the first seat. She nodded. That is dearer than money. I know. Together they hung the sign above the porch when the rain stopped. Everett came by with a level. Doris stood in the road with her arms crossed and said the left side was high when it was not. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat and offered his 4 words. Miriam arrived after closing, examined the lettering, and said the county records would not object to an ampersand if no one made her file a form before Monday. The sign did not erase the ghost of the first one. In certain light, if the weathered false front showed through shadow, the old name seemed to remain behind the new. That was right. Replacement was not the same as inheritance. The sons had had their time. The daughters had been there too, waiting in the work, the ledgers, the hidden notes, the careful hands. That night, after everyone had gone, Hazel began her own letter. She took good paper from the drawer, the kind she had ordered with part of the first folio payment. She trimmed it to size, squared the edges, and set it before her on the work table in the back room. The stove burned low. Rainwater ran cleanly from the roof into the barrel outside. The chimney pulled. The floor held. The window glass showed the walnut tree in a wavering dark reflection, and somewhere beneath its bark the open brass plate rested closed again, no longer secret in the same way, but still protected. She sharpened her pencil first, because ink should not be asked to carry a sentence before the sentence has learned to stand. Then she wrote the opening words exactly as they had once been written to her. My dear one, whoever you are. She stopped there for a while. A letter of inheritance could not be hurried. It had to tell the truth without making pain useful too quickly. It had to name what had been found, what had been repaired, what had been spent, what had been saved, and what had been left deliberately unopened. She would write about the granite slab in the cellar, with its balance mark still untouched at the center of the fieldstone floor. She would write that not every mystery needs a first owner, and not every door belongs to the present generation. She would write down the roof measurements, the lime ratios, the way the sash cords were knotted, the appraiser's address, the names of people who had helped without wanting ownership of the result. She would write about small kindnesses, because no accounting of the Mercantile would be true without them. The first draft took 3 evenings. She crossed out more than she kept. The second draft was slower. On the third, she began to understand that she was not writing to a descendant in the ordinary sense. She was writing to hunger, exile, fear, carefulness, and the unknown person who might one day stand in the doorway holding a bag with too little inside. Blood might bring that person. So might loss. So might a county auction notice folded into a pocket. The letter did not need to know. Near the closing, she added one sentence and let it stand. The Mercantile had been waiting, and so had she. The final page she left unsigned for several weeks, not from uncertainty, but because a signature closes a thing, and she was not ready to pretend the story had become fixed. There would be more repairs, more winters, more names on the mailing list, more mornings when work failed and a heron or a cup of coffee or a boy with a crooked grin would have to teach patience again. A building restored is still a building in weather. A life steadied is still a life moving through days. On the last Saturday before Christmas, snow began again. Hazel opened the store for 3 hours because the road remained passable, and Doris had told 3 customers she would. 2 came. 1 bought candles. 1 left a farm ledger for repair. Caleb stopped by to bring split wood and stayed long enough to drink tea from a chipped mug near the stove. Everett sent over a packet of brass screws wrapped in brown paper. Miriam did not come in, but a courthouse envelope arrived with her handwriting on the front. Inside was a photocopy of the recorded deed and a note saying the clerk's office was cleaning drawers before the new year. At the bottom, Miriam had written, "The dollar is still here." Hazel read the note twice, then pinned it inside the cash drawer. Not on display, only where she would see it when the bell rang and the drawer slid open. The first dollar had not been spent. It had not grown. It had not redeemed anything by itself. It had simply remained in a county desk, a plain witness that sometimes the smallest legal exchange can open a door no one else wanted. At closing, Hazel swept the floor from back to front, as Lorna would have done, gathering dust, thread ends, wax flakes, wood splinters, and the day's small evidence into one pan. She banked the stove, covered the folio on the counter, and stood for a moment beneath the walnut sign Caleb had carved. Outside, snow whitened the service lane. The river went on under the dark, cold and exact, carrying mountain water past the town as it had, before there were ledgers, before there were stores, before anyone thought to weigh gold against hunger. She turned the sign in the window to closed, though closed no longer meant abandoned. A Mercantile waits. It has always waited. And in a drawer at the Sierra County Clerk's office, under a brass paperweight shaped like a pine cone, one $1 bill lay flat in the dark, kept.